My name is Whitney, and I am 33 years old. I drove 9 hours straight through the night to surprise my grandmother at the exclusive luxury care facility my family claimed was costing them $10,000 a month. Instead, I walked into a bleak, underfunded state ward, smelling of stale bleach and boiled cabbage. I found my grandmother sitting completely alone by a drafty window, shivering in a soiled paper hospital gown. When a nurse finally approached me, she looked shocked and admitted they thought my grandmother had no family left. That was the moment I realized my mother and sister had been funding their lavish lifestyle with stolen money. Before I tell you how I tore their fake world apart, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe toxic family members deserve what is coming to them. For the past 8 months, I had been stationed in Chicago, leading a corporate audit for the forensic accounting firm where I work. My job involves tracing hidden assets and exposing financial fraud for major corporations. Ironically, I failed to apply those same investigative skills to my own family. My mother, Sharon, had always been a woman completely obsessed with appearances and high society status. Growing up, she made it very clear that my younger sister, Courtney, was the child destined for greatness. Courtney was the beautiful, outgoing socialite who commanded every room she entered. I was the quiet, analytical one who preferred spreadsheets to cocktail parties. My mother viewed my practical nature as a disappointment, but she never hesitated to rely on my income. When my grandmother Ruth began showing physical decline, my mother insisted on taking over her care. Ruth was the only person in our family who showed me unconditional love. While my mother constantly criticized my career choices, my grandmother baked my favorite cookies and told me how proud she was of my independence. When my mother found a premier private facility called Whispering Pines, I wanted to do my part. She sent me glossy brochures showing private suites, gourmet dining, and lush gardens. She claimed the monthly fee was astronomical, but insisted my grandmother deserved the best. For 8 months, I transferred $2,000 a month directly to my mother to help cover the specialized physical therapy and organic meal plans she claimed my grandmother was receiving. My project wrapped up a week early, so I decided to drive home and visit my grandmother unannounced. I wanted to surprise her with her favorite pastries and spend the afternoon catching up. I typed the address my mother had given me into my navigation system. As I drove further away from the affluent suburbs and entered a decaying industrial neighborhood, I assumed the application had made a routing error. The surroundings were bleak, with abandoned storefronts and cracked sidewalks. When the voice from my phone announced I had reached my destination, I pulled into a pothole-filled parking lot. I stared through my windshield at a massive concrete building with peeling gray paint and barred windows. A faded sign near the entrance read, Whispering Pines State Care Facility. There were no lush gardens or gourmet dining patios. There was only a rusted chain-link fence and overflowing trash bins. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I grabbed the box of pastries and walked through the sliding automatic doors. The lobby was dimly lit by buzzing fluorescent bulbs. The air was heavy with the scent of industrial cleaner, mixed with unwashed bodies. I bypassed the empty reception desk and walked down a long, narrow corridor. The paint on the walls was chipped, and medical carts cluttered the walkway. As I looked into the open doorways, I saw elderly patients crowded into small rooms with barely enough space to move. This was a state-run ward for people with no resources. I searched the room numbers until I found room 112. I stepped into the doorway and the sight made my breath catch. The room was tiny and cramped, containing 2 narrow metal beds separated by a thin curtain. Sitting in a rusted wheelchair by a window with cracked glass was my grandmother. The vibrant, sharp-minded woman who raised me was hunched over, staring blankly at the brick wall of the adjacent building. She was draped in a thin paper hospital gown that looked soiled at the edges. She was shivering as a cold draft seeped through the poorly sealed window. There was no television and no sign of personal belongings. She looked entirely abandoned. I dropped the box of pastries on a nearby tray table and rushed to her side. I wrapped my arms around her frail shoulders, calling her name softly. She blinked slowly, turning her head to look at me. It took a few moments for her eyes to focus, but when they did, a weak smile touched her lips. She whispered my name, her voice raspy and dry. I took off my heavy winter coat and draped it gently over her shaking body, wrapping it to provide some warmth. As I was checking her pale hands to see how cold she was, a woman in faded blue scrubs hurried into the room. She looked at me with an expression of complete shock. She introduced herself as Nurse Jasmine and asked who I was and what I was doing touching her patient. I stood up and tried to keep my voice steady. I told her I was Ruth's granddaughter, and I demanded to know why she was sitting by a drafty window in a paper gown instead of the private luxury suite my family was paying for. Nurse Jasmine stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. She closed the door to the hallway and lowered her voice. She explained that there were no private luxury suites in this building. This facility was a last resort for wards of the state and patients who had exhausted all their Medicare benefits. My mind struggled to process her words. I told her that was impossible because my mother was paying $10,000 a month for premier care. Nurse Jasmine looked at me with deep sympathy and shook her head. She pulled a worn clipboard from the foot of the bed and flipped through the pages. She informed me that my grandmother's account was actually 3 months delinquent. The state was preparing to transfer her to a lower-tier facility because no payments had been made. I felt the blood drain from my face. I asked when my mother had last visited or spoken to the administration. Jasmine flipped to another page in the chart and delivered the final crushing blow. She said my mother had dropped Ruth off 8 months ago and had not returned since. The facility had been leaving voicemails for weeks regarding the unpaid balance and declining health issues, but no one ever answered. Jasmine gently touched my arm, saying they honestly thought my grandmother had no family left who cared about her. Every monthly wire transfer I sent, every text message my mother had written about specialized physical therapy sessions and gourmet meals had been a complete fabrication. My mother had dumped the woman who raised her into a state-run facility, left her to rot in a paper gown, and simply pocketed my money. The sheer cruelty of it was suffocating. My mother had always favored my sister Courtney, but I never imagined she was capable of something this deeply sinister. I thanked Nurse Jasmine and promised I would be taking my grandmother out of this place immediately. I stepped out into the bleak hallway and pulled my phone from my pocket. My hands were shaking with a mix of profound grief and a rapidly building white-hot rage. I intended to call my mother and demand answers right then and there. But as I unlocked my screen, an Instagram notification popped up at the top of my display. It was a post from Courtney. I stared at the image loading on my screen. It was a live photo of Courtney and my mother sitting in wide leather seats. They were holding crystal glasses filled with champagne, posing with bright, perfect smiles. The location tag showed they were boarding a first-class flight to Aspen, Colorado. My mother was wearing a brand-new designer winter coat. I read the caption below the photo over and over again, until the words burned into my memory. It read, "Spoiling my amazing mom for the week. Hard work pays off, so grateful for this luxury lifestyle." They were drinking champagne at 30,000 feet while my grandmother shivered by a broken window. I did not call them. I locked my phone and walked back into the room. My firm paid me to hunt down financial predators. It was time to bring my work home. I stepped back into the sterile hallway, closing the heavy door to room 112, just enough to give my grandmother some quiet. My hands were still trembling, but the initial shock was rapidly solidifying into a cold, calculated focus. I pulled my phone back out and stared at the contact name for my mother. A woman I had trusted to care for the person who mattered most to me. A woman who was currently sipping expensive champagne while her own mother sat shivering in a paper gown. I pressed the call button and brought the phone to my ear. It rang 3 times before she picked up. The background noise immediately flooded the line. I could hear the faint sound of a jazz piano, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the unmistakable murmur of an upscale restaurant. "Whitney, I am really busy right now." My mother answered, her voice dripping with that familiar impatient tone she reserved exclusively for me. "Courtney and I are just sitting down for our hot stone treatments, and you are interrupting." "Where is Grandma?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low and even. There was a slight pause on the line, just long enough to tell me she knew exactly why I was asking. She is at her care facility, Whitney. Where else would she be? I do not have time to give you daily updates. I told you I have everything handled. I am standing inside Whispering Pines right now, I said, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. I am looking at a state-run ward that smells like bleach and decay. You told me she was at a premier private center. You sent me brochures. I have been transferring $2,000 a month to you to help pay for her specialized physical therapy. Why is she sitting alone by a broken window in a soiled paper gown? My mother let out a loud, exasperated sigh that echoed through the phone. She did not sound panicked or ashamed that she had been caught in a massive lie. She simply sounded annoyed that I was daring to question her. Please do not be so incredibly dramatic, Whitney. You always blow things entirely out of proportion. That luxury place was a complete waste of money. The nurses there were constantly hovering, and the fees were absolutely outrageous. Whispering Pines is perfectly adequate for someone in her condition. She does not even know the difference half the time. Adequate. I repeated the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. Her account is 3 months delinquent. The state is about to transfer her to an even worse facility. You abandoned her here 8 months ago and pocketed the money I sent you. I did not pocket anything. She snapped, her voice rising defensively over the background jazz music. Your sister desperately needed a down payment for her dream home. Courtney has been working so hard to build her brand, and you know how important aesthetics are for her career. She needed a property that reflected her success. The family makes sacrifices for each other, Whitney. That is what families do. The sheer audacity of her words left me momentarily breathless. Family makes sacrifices. In my mother's twisted reality, sacrifice meant stealing an 82-year-old woman's pension and her other daughter's hard-earned money to fund a fake luxury lifestyle for her golden child. It meant leaving a vulnerable woman to rot in a forgotten room so Courtney could post photos of a $1 million mansion on social media. You stole from her, I stated flatly, refusing to let her dress up her financial abuse in the guise of family loyalty. You dumped your own mother in a state ward to buy Courtney a house. You were always too sensitive, my mother shot back, launching into the exact same gaslighting tactics she had used my entire life. You have always been so incredibly jealous of Courtney. Just because you are 33 and single living alone with your spreadsheets does not mean you have to drag your sister down. She is successful and beautiful, and she deserves a nice home. Listening to her speak, the toxic dynamic of our entire childhood played out in my mind like a highlight reel of emotional abuse. When I won a full academic scholarship to study accounting, my mother skipped the awards dinner because Courtney had a minor cheerleading emergency. You are trying to ruin our vacation because you cannot stand seeing us happy. My mother continued, her voice taking on that sharp, victimized edge she perfected over decades. I will deal with the facility billing when I get back next week. Do not cause a scene. In the past, I would have argued, but standing in that hallway, looking through the cracked door at my fragile grandmother, I realized arguing with a narcissist was a waste of breath. My mother was devoid of empathy. She was a financial predator who happened to share my DNA. Enjoy your hot stone treatment, Mom, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying calm, because it is the last bit of luxury you are going to see for a very long time. I hung up the phone before she could say another word. I did not block her number yet. I wanted her to panic when she realized I was no longer playing by her rules. I shoved my phone into my pocket and walked back into room 112. The cold air from the faulty window was biting. My grandmother was still trembling, her frail hands clutched together in her lap. I shrugged off my heavy wool winter coat. It was thick and lined with fleece. I wrapped it carefully around her shoulders, tucking the fabric securely around her neck to block the draft. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with confusion, but she leaned into the warmth immediately. We are leaving, Grandma, I said softly, brushing a stray lock of silver hair from her forehead. I am taking you out of this place right now. You are never spending another night in a room like this again. I did not bother looking for her clothes. The few items stored in the tiny plastic bedside drawer were stained and threadbare. I unlocked the brakes on her rusted wheelchair and began pushing her toward the doorway. The wheels squeaked loudly, echoing against the linoleum floor. As we emerged from the corridor and approached the main reception area, the heavy-set woman behind the cluttered desk stood up abruptly. But now her eyes darted nervously from me to the wheelchair, realizing she was about to have a major problem on her hands. "Excuse me, miss," she called out, marching around the desk to block the sliding automatic doors. "You cannot just take a patient out of the facility. You need to sign the official medical release forms and clear this with the administration office, which is closed for the weekend." I stopped the wheelchair inches from her, letting my eyes lock onto hers. I had spent the last 10 years dismantling corrupt corporate executives in boardrooms. A bureaucratic front desk worker trying to enforce rules for a facility that could not even provide a warm blanket was not going to intimidate me. "My name is Whitney," I said, projecting my voice so it carried across the lobby. "I am a forensic accountant, and I know for a fact this facility has been illegally billing the state for a patient while turning a blind eye to massive financial exploitation. If you do not step away from those doors right now, my next phone call is to the state health inspector and the federal fraud division." The woman paled, her arrogant posture crumbling instantly. She took a step back, raising her hands in surrender. "I just work the front desk," she muttered, stepping out of my path. I pushed the wheelchair forward, and the glass automatic doors slid open instantly to reveal the crisp, biting winter air. I carefully guided my grandmother down the ramp and across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot toward my car. The cold wind whipped around us, but beneath my heavy coat, my grandmother was finally safe. I opened the passenger door and lifted her gently into the seat, securing the seatbelt around her fragile frame. I adjusted the vents to ensure the hot air blew directly on her shivering hands. She reached out and squeezed my fingers, a silent thank you that broke my heart all over again. I closed her door, walked around to the driver's side, and slid behind the wheel. As I started the engine and pulled away from that decaying concrete building, I looked at her resting quietly in the warmth of the heater. I was going to retrieve every dime they took. My mother and sister had picked the wrong person to steal from. The drive from the crumbling industrial park to the pristine campus of Chicago's premier research hospital took 45 agonizing minutes. I kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other wrapped tightly around my grandmother's icy fingers. She had fallen into an exhausted, shallow sleep the moment the car's heater warmed her fragile bones. Every time we hit a pothole, her feather-light frame seemed to rattle against the leather passenger seat. I pulled directly into the emergency drop-off bay, ignoring the blaring horns behind me, and threw the car into park. Before the valet could even approach, I was out of my seat, shouting for a wheelchair and a triage nurse. The medical staff took one look at her pale, sunken face and the filthy paper gown clinging to her skin and immediately sprang into motion. I jogged alongside the gurney as they wheeled her through the sliding double doors, rattling off her name, her age, and the medication list my mother had sent me months ago. A list that I now deeply suspected had never actually been filled. The bright, sterile lights of the trauma bay washed over her, highlighting the terrifying extent of her physical deterioration. Her cheekbones jutted out sharply against translucent, paper-thin skin. Her wrists were bruised and painfully delicate. The admitting nurse pulled me aside, her eyes filled with professional concern, mixed with poorly disguised horror. She asked me how long my grandmother had been living in these specific conditions. I swallowed the thick lump of bile rising in my throat and told her the truth. I had absolutely no idea, but I was going to find out. The next 3 hours were a chaotic blur of beeping monitors, rushing nurses, and the heavy clinical scent of antiseptic. I sat in a hard plastic chair in the corner of the examination room, watching as they hooked my grandmother up to a complex web of intravenous fluids and broad-spectrum antibiotics. Finally, the attending physician, a tall man with a grim, deeply serious expression, walked in holding a digital tablet. He did not mince words. He told me Ruth was suffering from profound clinical malnutrition and severe dehydration. Her kidneys were actively struggling to function because she had not been receiving adequate fluids for weeks. perhaps even months. More alarmingly, he pointed out a series of completely untreated infections. She had a rampant urinary tract infection that was dangerously close to becoming septic, and several bed sores that had been left to fester without basic medical dressing or turning schedules. He looked at me directly, his voice tight with controlled anger, and stated that this was a textbook case of severe elder neglect. He informed me that under state law, the hospital was legally required to file an official report with Adult Protective Services immediately. I did not flinch. I looked the doctor dead in the eye and told him to file the report right away. I told him I wanted every single injury, every infection, and every sign of starvation documented with meticulous clinical precision. I wanted high-resolution photographs taken for the official medical record. I needed an ironclad paper trail. The doctor's expression softened slightly, realizing I was not the perpetrator of this horrifying abuse, but the one seeking absolute justice for it. He nodded, promising that his medical team would build a comprehensive file detailing every ounce of neglect she had suffered under my mother's supposed care. As he turned back to check her cardiac monitors, my phone began vibrating violently in my pocket. I pulled the device out the screen, lighting up the dim corner of the hospital room. It was a barrage of text messages from Courtney. My mother had clearly called her golden child to complain about my sudden appearance and my ungrateful attitude. The messages came through in rapid succession, a digital manifestation of my sister's lifelong toxic entitlement. I opened the thread and read the first text. "Mom says you are throwing a massive tantrum over Grandma. Stop trying to ruin my housewarming week, you psycho." I stared at the glowing letters. Courtney was moving into her new $1.5 million estate on Saturday, and she was furiously offended that my concern for our grandmother's basic survival was interrupting her aesthetic party planning. Another text buzzed through. "You always do this, Whitney. You always have to make everything about your weird obsessive need for control. The luxury place was a waste of money anyway. Courtney desperately needed a down payment for her dream home. Family makes sacrifices." A third message followed immediately. "You are always too sensitive. Stop trying to ruin your sister's big month just because you are jealous you are single and she is successful. Put Grandma back where she belongs and go back to your lonely apartment." I watched the typing bubble appear and disappear as Courtney continued her unhinged rant, completely oblivious to the massive felony wire fraud she and our mother were currently committing. She honestly believed that pointing out my single status and independent lifestyle was the ultimate devastating insult. She actually thought that calling me jealous would force me to back down and apologize, just like I had been forced to do when we were teenagers. My mother and sister had spent my entire life gaslighting me, twisting my valid concerns into character flaws. But I was no longer a teenager seeking their validation. I was a senior forensic auditor who had successfully dismantled corrupt corporate hedge fund managers. I did not type a single word in response. I simply took a screenshot of her message, explicitly admitting that the care funds were used for a down payment, making sure the timestamp was clearly visible. I saved the image into a newly created secure folder on my phone titled Evidence. Courtney wanted to talk about her dream life and her lavish catered housewarming party. She had absolutely no idea that I was already mapping out the financial autopsy that would tear her new mansion down to the foundational studs. Sitting there listening to the steady rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, I let myself truly look at the woman who had practically raised me. When I was a little girl, Ruth was an absolute force of nature. She was the formidable matriarch who single-handedly managed the family hardware store after my grandfather passed away, balancing the heavy paper ledgers with a sharp pencil and an even sharper mind. It was Ruth who had taught me how to read a basic balance sheet when I was only 12 years old. She used to sit with me at the kitchen table, sliding columns of numbers across the wood, explaining that numbers never lie, even when people do. She had instilled in me the analytical mind that my mother so deeply despised and mocked. Now the brilliant woman who had navigated complex tax laws and managed a thriving local business was reduced to a fragile shell betrayed by her own greedy daughter. My mother had taken full advantage of Ruth's physical decline, stripping away her autonomy and her assets, under the guise of providing luxury care. Sharon had convinced the entire extended family that Ruth's mind was completely failing, that she required intense isolation for her own safety. It was a perfectly executed isolation tactic utilized by financial predators. By cutting off Ruth's communication with the outside world, Sharon ensured no one could verify the quality of care being provided. No one except me, the granddaughter who lived 3 states away and relied on deceitful text updates. A hospital admissions clerk quietly knocked on the doorframe, interrupting my dark thoughts. She carried a thick stack of intake forms attached to a plastic clipboard. She offered a highly sympathetic smile and gently asked if I had my grandmother's identification cards, insurance information, and any legal power of attorney documents. I nodded, realizing I needed to search through the few pathetic belongings I had grabbed from the state facility. I had brought her battered leather handbag, a vintage piece she had owned for as long as I could remember. It was heavily scuffed at the corners, and the brass clasp was tarnished, but it was the only piece of her old life that had survived my mother's cruel purge. I placed the handbag carefully on my lap and unclasped it. The inside was sparse and depressing. A half-empty packet of generic tissues, a dried-out ballpoint pen, and a cheap plastic comb. There was no leather wallet in the main compartment. I slid my fingers along the bottom of the bag, searching for a zippered pocket or a card sleeve. As I pressed firmly against the worn fabric lining, I felt something hard and unyielding concealed deep between the layers of leather. It was not a loose coin or a misplaced pill bottle. It felt deliberately flat and rigid. I frowned, running my thumb heavily along the inner seam of the purse. The heavy stitching near the bottom right corner felt surprisingly loose, as if it had been unraveled and carefully reknotted by hand. Ruth had always been an expert seamstress capable of mending absolutely anything with invisible stitches. I pulled out my car keys, using the sharp, jagged edge to carefully pry apart the weakened thread. The lining gave way with a soft tearing sound. I slid 2 fingers into the hidden cavity and pulled out a small, tightly sealed waterproof plastic pouch. Inside the protective pouch was a heavy brass key with a stamped serial number and a thickly folded piece of high-quality parchment paper. I stared at the items, my forensic investigative instincts flaring to life. A safety deposit box key. I carefully unfolded the thick paper. It was a formal typed letter bearing the raised blue seal of a licensed notary public. The date printed at the top indicated it had been drafted and legally witnessed exactly 3 years ago, right before my mother officially forced her way into taking control of Ruth's living arrangements. The handwriting at the very top, however, was undeniably Ruth's. Her elegant, sweeping cursive stood out in stark black ink against the typed legal jargon below. I held my breath as I read the handwritten note addressed directly to me. It read, "For Whitney when they finally show their true colors. Do what you do best, sweetheart." I stared at the heavy cream parchment in my hands. Do what you do best, sweetheart. The words echoed in my mind as the chaotic noise of the emergency room faded into a dull background hum. The attending physician had just assured me that my grandmother was completely stable. She was receiving intravenous antibiotics for her infections, absorbing much-needed fluids, and finally resting comfortably in a secure private recovery suite. I had explicitly instructed the hospital administration that my mother and my sister were legally barred from entry under any circumstances. I cited suspected elder abuse, and the hospital security team immediately placed a guard near her door. With my grandmother finally safe and protected, my overwhelming sorrow instantly hardened into a sharp, cold weapon. I folded the notarized letter carefully and gripped the heavy brass safety deposit box key in my palm. My professional instincts, which had been clouded by family loyalty, were now fully awake and screaming for action. I marched out of the hospital, sliding into my car, and drove straight to the downtown branch of First Metropolitan Bank. The drive took less than 20 minutes, but my mind was racing through 1,000 different financial scenarios. I parked my car and walked through the heavy revolving glass doors of the bank. The air inside was completely sterile and quiet, a sharp contrast to the decaying state ward where my mother had abandoned her own flesh and blood. I approached the front desk and presented the brass key alongside my own government identification. I informed the bank manager that I needed immediate access to the vault. The manager, a tall man in a tailored suit, examined the serial number stamped into the brass. He typed a few keystrokes into his computer terminal, and his posture instantly shifted to one of extreme deference. He asked me to follow him and led me past the teller stations toward the back of the building. We stopped in front of a massive steel vault door. He unlocked the exterior gate and escorted me into a small private viewing room with a polished mahogany table in the center. He handed me a heavy metal lockbox, bowed slightly, and closed the privacy door behind him. The room was completely silent. I set the metal box on the mahogany table and took a deep breath. I inserted the brass key into the lock and turned it. The mechanism clicked open with a heavy, satisfying sound. I lifted the lid, expecting to find a few pieces of vintage jewelry or old savings bonds. Instead, the box was packed to the brim with thick manila envelopes, bound legal portfolios, and a worn leather ledger. I reached in and pulled out the largest bound document. The cover page bore the seal of a prominent corporate law firm. I flipped open the heavy cover and began to read the dense legal jargon. My eyes scanned the paragraphs, quickly absorbing the financial terminology that I dealt with every single day at my accounting firm. What I was holding was an ironclad, irrevocable living trust. The document was dated exactly 3 years ago, right around the time my grandmother first started showing minor signs of physical frailty. The terms of the trust were absolute and legally impenetrable. Ruth had secretly transferred her entire lifetime of savings into this secure vehicle, completely shielding it from probate and any outside interference. I turned to the asset schedule attached to the back of the trust, and my breath caught in my throat. Listed on the page was a massive, fully diversified investment portfolio containing municipal bonds, blue-chip stocks, and liquid mutual funds. The total current valuation of the untouched portfolio sat at just over $3 million. I sank into the leather chair, staring at the staggering number printed on the page. My mother had spent the last 3 years crying poverty to our entire extended family. She had convinced everyone, including me, that my grandfather had made terrible investments before his death and left Ruth completely destitute. Sharon had spun a masterful, tragic narrative claiming she was heroically sacrificing her own retirement savings to keep her mother afloat. In reality, Ruth was a multimillionaire who had quietly protected her real wealth because she knew exactly what her daughter was capable of doing. I continued digging through the box and found another legal document neatly clipped to the trust. It was a comprehensive and durable power of attorney. The document explicitly stripped Sharon of any and all medical or financial decision-making authority. Ruth had legally transferred full and absolute power of attorney directly to me. She had trusted me to handle her life when the time finally came. She knew her own daughter was a predator waiting to strike, and she had laid a silent trap 3 years in advance. I placed the legal documents aside and reached for the worn leather ledger sitting at the very bottom of the metal box. I opened the ledger and recognized my grandmother's meticulous accounting shorthand immediately. The pages contained an action-based history of my mother's relentless financial deception. Ruth had maintained 2 separate bank accounts. The massive $3 million trust was hidden at First Metropolitan Bank, while her smaller monthly pension was deposited into an old local credit union account. Ruth had written detailed notes documenting how she played along with my mother's narrative of poverty. She played broke on purpose to see who in the family would actually show up to care for her out of love rather than greed. The ledger revealed the heartbreaking answer. Only I had shown up while Sharon and Courtney had immediately begun circling like vultures. I turned the page and found a section where Ruth had painstakingly tracked the activity in her local credit union account. She received a generous corporate pension of $8,000 every single month. According to the ledger notes, Sharon had aggressively demanded access to that specific account, claiming she needed to manage the funds to pay for Ruth's supposedly expensive care facility. I closed my eyes as a vivid memory surfaced. 2 years ago, at our family Thanksgiving dinner, Sharon had stood in the kitchen holding a glass of wine and weeping dramatically. She claimed Ruth's pension barely covered the cost of adult diapers and basic medications. She had guilted me into paying for the entire holiday catering and manipulated me into setting up the $2,000 monthly wire transfers. I looked back down at the ledger and let my forensic accounting skills take complete control. My grandmother had requested copies of her canceled checks from the credit union before she was locked away in the state ward. She had folded them neatly between the pages of the ledger. I spread the canceled checks across the mahogany table and examined them under the bright overhead light. The signature on the bottom right corner of each check spelled out Ruth's name, but the handwriting was completely wrong. Ruth had a beautiful sweeping cursive that slanted slightly to the right. The signatures on these checks were rigid, heavy-handed, and looped awkwardly at the bottom. It was my mother's distinct handwriting. Sharon had been systematically forging Ruth's signature for nearly 3 years. She had not just been managing the $8,000 monthly pension, she had been actively siphoning every single cent of it into her own private accounts. The sheer scale of the embezzlement was staggering. Between the stolen pension and the $2,000 a month I had been blindly sending her, Sharon had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars. My mind clicked into high gear, calculating the exact statutes she had violated. This was not a simple family dispute. This was federal wire fraud, elder financial exploitation, and felony forgery. Sharon had left her mother to starve in a freezing room so she could fund first-class flights to Aspen and buy designer clothes. But my mother was sloppy, and I was a professional auditor. I reached back into the metal box and pulled out the final manila envelope. It was thick and heavy. I tore open the seal and dumped the contents onto the table. A massive stack of bank statements and wire transfer receipts tumbled out. Sharon thought she had successfully hidden all her financial tracks when she took over the care arrangements, but she underestimated my grandmother's brilliance. Ruth had managed to intercept the credit union statements in the mail before Sharon locked her away. I began sorting the receipts by date, organizing them into a chronological timeline of theft. I traced the money flowing out of the pension account into Sharon's personal checking account. Then I noticed something strange about the most recent wire transfers. The stolen money was not just funding luxury vacations and expensive champagne. Over the past 8 months, Sharon had authorized a series of massive structured transfers, moving $30,000 at a time. I grabbed a pen from my purse and began jotting down the routing numbers listed on the receipts. The money was not staying in Sharon's account. It was being pushed out immediately to a third-party financial institution. I stared at the routing numbers and pulled out my phone, cross-referencing the digits with public banking registries. The routing numbers belonged to a premier real estate escrow company located in Courtney's affluent neighborhood. I looked at the dates of the massive wire transfers. They aligned perfectly with the timeline Courtney had bragged about online when she first announced she was buying a house. I pulled up Courtney's Instagram profile on my phone and looked at the photo she had posted exactly 3 weeks ago. She was standing in front of a massive brick estate, holding a set of keys with a smug smile. The caption read, "Closing day on my $1.5 million dream home. So proud to be a self-made homeowner at 29. I looked from the photo on my phone to the forged wire transfer receipts sitting on the mahogany table. The pieces of the puzzle locked together with devastating clarity. Courtney was not a self-made success, and Sharon was not a generous mother sacrificing for her children. The entire down payment for Courtney's lavish $1.5 million mansion had been funded directly by an 82-year-old woman's stolen pension. They had literally drained my grandmother's life savings, forced her into a decaying state facility, and used the stolen cash to buy a luxury estate. I gathered the evidence, slipped the heavy ledger into my bag, and smiled as I walked out of the bank vault, knowing I was about to burn their entire stolen world to the ground. I drove back to the hospital with the heavy leather ledger sitting on the passenger seat beside me. The sterile, brightly lit cafeteria was mostly empty at this hour, offering the perfect, isolated environment for a mobile command center. I claimed a corner booth near a wall outlet, purchased the strongest black coffee they had, and arranged the forged checks and wire transfer receipts across the sticky laminated table. I opened my laptop and cracked my knuckles. For the past decade, I had untangled the complex financial webs of corrupt hedge fund managers and embezzling corporate executives. Tracking a vain suburban mother and her desperate socialite daughter was going to be effortless. I logged into my secure firm portal utilizing my specialized access to public property records and regional banking databases. I started by running the routing numbers from the wire transfers I had found in the vault. The initial deposits were clumsy. Sharon had transferred small increments of $2,000 to $3,000 from my grandmother's credit union account directly into her own personal checking account. She used those funds to pay for mundane luxury items like spa treatments, designer shoes, and high-end grocery deliveries. But as the months progressed and Courtney's demand for a luxury home escalated, the theft became far more aggressive and structured. I tracked a massive $40,000 withdrawal that occurred exactly 4 days before Courtney signed the initial mortgage contract. Sharon had attempted to camouflage the transaction by routing the money through a secondary shell account she had opened under a fake consulting business name. It was a pathetic attempt at money laundering. I pulled the public articles of incorporation for the consulting business and found Sharon's home address and phone number listed on the registered agent paperwork. From there, the money flowed directly into the escrow account of a premier real estate brokerage firm located in Courtney's affluent new zip code. I mercilessly cross-referenced every single date. On the exact day, Sharon claimed my grandmother required an emergency transfer to a secure memory care unit due to violent outbursts, she had actually wired $15,000 to a high-end interior designer. On the day she told me she was paying out of pocket for specialized physical therapy, she had purchased a pair of first-class tickets to Aspen. Every lie was backed by a corresponding transaction. I built a massive color-coded spreadsheet documenting every stolen cent, every forged signature, and every fraudulent wire transfer. I downloaded the official property deed for Courtney's new mansion. There it was in black and white. The down payment matched the stolen pension funds down to the exact dollar. They had not just taken my grandmother's money, they had stolen her dignity and her comfort to buy a house with a chef's kitchen and a heated pool. The sheer callousness of the crime made my vision blur with anger. I was pulling down the tax records for Courtney's new property, verifying that she had fraudulently claimed the stolen down payment as a legitimate personal gift from our mother when my phone screen lit up. It was an incoming call from an unrecognized local number. I let it go to voicemail and immediately accessed my messages. It was the administration office from the state ward. The message was frantic. The facility director stated that Sharon had just called them from Aspen, furiously demanding to speak with the nursing staff about a billing issue. When the nurses informed Sharon that I had physically removed Ruth from the premises hours ago, Sharon had completely lost her mind. The director was calling to verify that I possessed the legal authority to transport the patient. I did not call the director back. I had the irrevocable power of attorney sitting right next to my coffee cup. Sharon had just realized that her perfect, isolated trap had been blown wide open. She knew I had Ruth. She knew I had seen the horrific conditions of the state ward, but she did not know I had the key to the vault. She assumed I was simply reacting emotionally to the paper gown and the broken window. She had no idea I was sitting in a hospital cafeteria holding the complete financial blueprint of her looming incarceration. 10 minutes later, my phone began to vibrate violently against the table. A notification popped up indicating I had been added to a newly created group message. I tapped the screen and saw that Sharon had initiated a massive text thread, including every single member of our extended family. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and even distant relatives we rarely spoke to were all added to the chat. Sharon was launching a preemptive strike. She knew she had to control the narrative before I could expose the truth about the state facility. The first message from Sharon was a masterclass in manipulative hysteria. It read, "Please everyone, pray for us. Whitney has completely lost her mind. She showed up unannounced and literally kidnapped your grandmother from her premier luxury memory care facility." The doctors explicitly said Ruth needs 24-hour specialized supervision, and Whitney just dragged her out into the freezing cold. I am terrified for my mother's safety. Before I could even process the audacity of the lie, Courtney immediately chimed in to reinforce the fabricated narrative. She typed, "Whitney has always been wildly jealous of our relationship with Grandma. Now she is trying to isolate her so she can steal her Social Security checks. Mom and I are cutting our Aspen trip short and rushing home to deal with this psycho. We might have to call the police." I sat back in my vinyl booth and watched the messages flood my screen. The extended family members who had not bothered to visit my grandmother in years instantly took the bait. The toxic family dynamic I had endured my entire life was playing out in real time. My Aunt Barbara replied first. "I always knew Whitney had deep psychological issues. To endanger an 82-year-old woman out of pure spite is absolutely unforgivable." My Uncle David quickly followed. "Sharon, do you want me to drive over to Whitney's apartment and demand she hand over the medical proxy? We cannot let a failed, jealous spinster put our mother in danger just to steal a few $100s a month." The attacks came fast and vicious. My cousin Jessica added her own cruelty, writing, "I told you guys Whitney was unstable when she skipped the family reunion last year. She has always resented Courtney for being beautiful and having a real life. They called me a failure, a thief, a deranged and lonely woman who was lashing out because I could not achieve the same high society success as Courtney." They praised Sharon for her selfless dedication to Ruth's care over the past year. They fawned over Courtney, expressing their deep sympathy that her beautiful housewarming week was being ruined by my alleged mental breakdown. Not a single person in the chat asked for my side of the story. Not one relative paused to question why a forensic accountant with a spotless professional record would suddenly kidnap an elderly woman. They simply fell in line, eager to tear down the family scapegoat to elevate the golden child. Every nasty comment, every misguided insult, and every blind declaration of support for Sharon and Courtney only fueled the cold fire burning in my chest. I watched the digital smear campaign unfold for another 20 minutes, refusing to block the number or mute the notifications. I wanted to read every single word they wrote. I needed to know exactly who was complicit in this toxic echo chamber so I could permanently sever ties with all of them when the dust settled. My phone buzzed again with another message from Sharon. "Whitney, if you do not bring my mother back to the facility immediately, I am calling my lawyer and the authorities. You will be arrested for elder abduction. Do not ruin your life over a petty temper tantrum." I took a slow sip of my lukewarm coffee and cracked my neck. I saved the massive spreadsheet confirming the $3 million trust and the exact routing details of the embezzled pension funds. I exported the final forensic audit report and attached the forged signature files. My family thought I was a weak, jealous sibling who would cower under the weight of their collective disapproval. They expected me to panic and beg for forgiveness. Instead of drafting a desperate defense, I simply opened the group chat keyboard. I did not argue with my aunts or uncles. I did not try to convince them that Ruth had been neglected. I did not even mention the state ward, the paper gown, or the freezing window. I typed a single response and hit send. "I have the receipts. See you all at Courtney's housewarming party on Saturday." I closed the laptop. I closed my laptop with a soft, satisfying click right there in the hospital cafeteria. The digital silence from the family group chat was palpable. My phone had stopped buzzing the second I sent that final message. Sharon and Courtney were likely scrambling frantically trying to figure out what I meant by receipts. They assumed I was bluffing. They always assumed I was bluffing. But I was not done. The stolen pension funds and the monthly wire transfers I had blindly sent were only the down payment for Courtney's new life. To secure a $1.5 million mortgage on a yoga instructor's salary, Courtney needed a massive collateral injection. I knew exactly where that collateral came from. The bank ledger had referenced another major asset, Ruth's vintage summer estate in the Berkshires. I pulled up my phone and dialed the number for Arthur Sterling. Arthur was the longtime family attorney, a man who wore expensive Italian suits and reeked of cheap cologne and questionable ethics. He had handled my grandfather's initial estate and had smoothly transitioned into acting as my mother's legal shield. The phone rang 3 times before his receptionist patched me through to his private line. Whitney. My dear Arthur's voice oozed through the speaker, thick with a patronizing warmth that immediately made my skin crawl. I was just about to call you. Your mother has been frantically trying to reach me. She is absolutely beside herself with worry. We really need to discuss this little stunt you pulled at the care facility today. It was not a stunt, Arthur, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. It was an emergency medical extraction. Ruth is currently being treated for severe malnutrition and systemic infections that occurred while under my mother's supposed supervision. Arthur let out a long, exasperated sigh. It was the exact same condescending sound my mother used whenever I pointed out an uncomfortable truth. Let us not exaggerate the situation, Whitney. Older people get frail. It is a natural part of life. What is not natural is you showing up unannounced, bypassing the legal proxy, and removing a vulnerable woman from her specialized medical environment. Your mother is the designated power of attorney. You are perilously close to facing kidnapping charges. Am I asked, pulling up the digital copy of the true irrevocable trust on my phone. Yes, you are. Arthur snapped, his fake warmth evaporating, instantly revealing the arrogant bully beneath. Sharon has explicitly authorized me to draft the preliminary paperwork for a restraining order against you. You have always been a disgruntled, jealous sibling, Whitney. We all know this. You have spent your entire life resenting Courtney's success and your mother's perfectly reasonable decisions. But dragging your senile grandmother into your petty familial squabbles is crossing a massive legal line. I strongly advise you to return Ruth to the facility within the hour before I involve the state police. I let his threats hang in the air for a long moment, allowing him to bask in his own perceived authority. I wanted him to feel absolutely secure right before I shattered his entire reality. Arthur, I want you to listen to me very carefully, I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy register. Because the next 60 seconds will permanently determine whether you spend the remainder of your professional career enjoying early retirement or serving a lengthy sentence in a federal penitentiary. He scoffed loudly. Are you threatening me? Because I can assure you that threatening a licensed attorney is a severe mistake. I am not threatening you, I interrupted smoothly. I am informing you. 3 years ago, Ruth executed a fully notarized, irrevocable living trust and granted me complete and exclusive durable power of attorney. She bypassed you entirely because she knew you were corrupt. I have the original documents. They supersede absolutely everything Sharon has forced you to file over the past 2 years. The line went dead silent. The heavy breathing on the other end was the only indication that Arthur had not hung up in a complete panic. Now I continued, pressing my advantage with surgical precision. Let us discuss the fraudulent sale of Ruth's vintage estate in the Berkshires. You handled the closing last month, did you not? The property sold for $850,000. But those funds never touched Ruth's primary accounts. They were never used for her medical care. I have no idea what you are talking about, Arthur stammered, though his voice had lost all of its previous bravado. That transaction was entirely legal. Sharon acted under her authority as the primary medical and financial proxy. Sharon acted under a forged document, Arthur stated flatly. And you knowingly facilitated the theft. I am a senior forensic accountant. I spent the last 3 hours tracking the wire transfers. The funds from the estate sale were routed through your firm's private trust account. From there, exactly $850,000 was wired directly into the escrow account for Courtney's new $1.5 million property. The routing numbers match perfectly. You used a dying woman's property to illegally fund a massive real estate purchase for her spoiled granddaughter. That is an absurd accusation, Arthur said, but the distinct tremor in his voice betrayed his rising terror. I simply executed the paperwork provided to me by your mother. I am not responsible for verifying the internal family dynamics of a financial transfer. You are responsible for verifying the authenticity of the signatures I countered relentlessly, which you failed to do because you are completely complicit. Let us review the federal statutes you have violated, Arthur. Title 18, United States Code Section 1343 Wire Fraud. That is up to 20 years in federal prison. Title 18 United States Code, Section 1028A, Aggravated Identity Theft. That carries a mandatory consecutive sentence. Furthermore, under the Elder Abuse Prevention and Prosecution Act, the penalties for financially exploiting a vulnerable adult over the age of 65 are severely amplified. I paused, letting the heavy legal citations sink into his rapidly calculating brain. I could picture him sitting in his lavish office, the blood draining from his face, as he watched his entire comfortable life evaporate before his eyes. You did not just rubber stamp a questionable family loan, Arthur. I continued, twisting the knife. You actively participated in a coordinated conspiracy to strip an elderly woman of her life savings, funnel the money through your own legal trust, and deposit it into a third-party escrow account. You bypassed the standard anti-money laundering protocols. You willfully ignored the fiduciary duty you owed to Ruth as her original estate attorney. The moment I hand my forensic audit over to the State Bar Association, you will lose your license to practice law permanently. But that is just the absolute beginning. When I hand this complete file over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, they will immediately seize all of your personal assets, freeze your firm's operating accounts, and publicly indict you before the week is completely over. Whitney, please, you must listen to me, Arthur pleaded. The arrogant, condescending tone was utterly eradicated. He sounded exactly like what he was, a terrified, pathetic man backed into a corner with absolutely no way out. You are completely misunderstanding my involvement here. I was horribly manipulated. Sharon lied to me. She presented me with documents that appeared entirely legitimate. She told me Ruth was fully aware of the transfer and wanted to bless Courtney with an early inheritance. Do not insult my intelligence, I snapped. You knew exactly what Sharon was doing. You took your hefty percentage off the top of the closing costs and looked the other way. You are just as guilty as she is, and you will face the exact same prison sentence. I will cooperate, Arthur blurted out, his voice cracking with pure, desperate survival instinct. Whatever you need, Whitney. I will give you absolutely everything. I can prove Sharon orchestrated the entire thing. I can prove she forged the signatures. Just please, I am begging you, do not take this to the federal authorities. I have a family. I have a reputation to maintain in this city. I will testify against them. I will flip on Sharon and Courtney today. I will do whatever it takes. You will do exactly as I say, I commanded, enjoying the absolute power I now held over the man who had helped destroy my grandmother's life. You are going to send me the complete unredacted file for the Berkshire estate sale. I want every single email communication between you and Sharon regarding the transfer of funds. I want the digital closing documents, the original drafts, and every single piece of correspondence you have detailing the escrow funnel to Courtney's property. I am sending it right now, Arthur stammered, the sound of frantic keyboard clicking echoing loudly through the phone speaker. I am attaching the entire digital dossier. You will see that Sharon was the one directing the funds. You will see that I was just following her explicit instructions. You have 5 minutes, I said coldly. If I do not have the complete file in my inbox by the time I finish my coffee, I am dialing the FBI directly. I disconnected the call without waiting for his response and set my phone face down on the cafeteria table. I leaned back against the vinyl booth, finally taking a moment to breathe. The adrenaline that had been fueling me since I walked into the state ward was beginning to settle, leaving behind a profound sense of clarity. Breaking Arthur Sterling had been almost too easy. He was a coward who hid behind legal loopholes and expensive suits. But the moment he faced real, unyielding consequences, his entire facade crumbled. I knew he would turn on my mother without a second thought. There is no loyalty among thieves, especially when federal prison is staring them directly in the face. I did not have to wait 5 minutes. Less than 60 seconds later, my laptop chimed with an incoming email notification. The subject line was completely blank, but the sender was Arthur Sterling's secure legal address. I opened the message and downloaded the massive attached zip file. It took several seconds for the heavy encrypted data to fully process onto my hard drive. It was an absolute treasure trove of undeniable guilt. Arthur had sent the entire closing packet, the fraudulent power of attorney forms Sharon had used, and the direct email chains outlining their entire scheme. I opened the digital closing contract for the Berkshire estate. I clicked on the document properties, running a quick metadata extraction. The results populated instantly on my screen, bringing a cold, triumphant smile to my face. The digital footprint was completely unmistakable. The document had not been authored by Arthur's legal team or signed by Ruth. The embedded metadata unequivocally proved the fraudulent closing documents had been created, edited, and digitally signed from the exact IP address registered to Sharon's personal home computer. The trap was fully set. I closed my laptop and slid it into my leather briefcase. The digital trap was primed. By the following morning, the hospital medical team determined Ruth was stable enough to be discharged into my direct custody. They arranged for a private medical transport to my secure townhouse. I transformed my spacious first-floor guest room into a comfortable recovery sanctuary, complete with fresh linens, a medical-grade adjustable bed, and 24-hour professional nursing assistance paid for directly from the newly unlocked trust fund. For the first time in nearly a year, my grandmother slept soundly. I sat at my wide dining room table, organizing the massive mountain of evidence I had collected. The thick white binder contained everything: the pristine hospital reports detailing the severe neglect, the authentic, irrevocable power of attorney, the bank ledger, the canceled forged checks, and the newly acquired metadata from the corrupt lawyer. I arranged the documents into perfect chronological order. I knew my mother and sister were not going to simply retreat. They were arrogant, entitled, and cornered. They were going to make a massive, desperate move to regain control of their stolen cash cow. The heavy pounding on my front door started exactly at 9 o'clock in the morning. It was not a polite knock. It was the aggressive, authoritative hammering of law enforcement demanding immediate entry. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blouse. I walked to the entryway and pulled open the heavy wooden door. Two uniformed police officers stood on my porch, their hands resting casually but purposefully near their utility belts. A marked squad car was parked diagonally across my driveway. The lead officer, a broad-shouldered man with a tight jaw and a stern expression, stepped forward and locked his eyes onto mine. "Are you Whitney?" he demanded, his voice projecting absolute authority. "I am," I replied, keeping my posture relaxed and my voice entirely neutral. "Ma'am, we received a frantic emergency call from your mother, Sharon," he stated. "She reported a suspected elder abduction. She claims you showed up at a state medical facility acting erratically and forcefully removed your 82-year-old grandmother against medical advice. She also stated that you have a history of severe mental instability and that your grandmother is in imminent physical danger. We need to come inside, see the elderly woman immediately, and verify her safety. We also have an emergency order to transport her back to the facility, and we will be taking you into custody." The sheer audacity of my mother's smear campaign was breathtaking. She had weaponized the local police department, hoping their intimidating presence would cause me to panic and surrender. She genuinely believed her fabricated narrative of the mentally unstable, jealous sister would hold up against physical evidence. I did not panic. I did not raise my voice or act defensively. I simply stepped back and pulled the front door wide open, gesturing gracefully toward the interior of my home. "Officers, please come inside," I said, my voice projecting an icy calm. "You are absolutely right to take a report of elder endangerment seriously. I welcome your presence here today. In fact, I was planning on calling your precinct within the hour." The officers exchanged a brief, confused glance. They had expected a hysterical screaming match or a desperate barricade situation. My absolute compliance threw them off balance. They stepped cautiously into my entryway, their eyes sweeping the pristine, organized space. "Where is Ruth?" the second officer asked, his hand resting near his radio. "She is resting comfortably in the guest room down the hall," I answered. "I have a registered private nurse sitting with her right now, monitoring her vitals." "You are more than welcome to check on her, but before you do, I strongly suggest you look at the documents sitting on my dining room table. It will completely reframe the nature of your investigation." The lead officer frowned, his jaw tightening further. Ma'am, we are not here to look at your personal paperwork. We are here to execute a welfare check and a medical extraction based on the legal authority of the primary caretaker. Sharon is not the primary caretaker, I stated flatly, holding my ground. And she has zero legal authority over my grandmother. Please step into the dining room. It will take exactly 2 minutes of your time. If you still want to arrest me after reading the first page, I will gladly hand you my wrists. The absolute certainty in my voice made the lead officer pause. He nodded sharply to his partner, and they followed me into the dining room. The heavy white binder sat precisely in the center of the mahogany table. I opened the cover and slid the first document toward them. This is the official medical intake report from Chicago Premier Research Hospital dated yesterday afternoon. I explained, tracing my finger along the printed text. You will see the attending physician's explicit diagnosis. My grandmother was suffering from profound clinical malnutrition, severe dehydration, and multiple untreated systemic infections while living in the state facility my mother selected. She was left sitting in a soiled paper gown in a freezing room with a broken window. The hospital has already filed a mandatory report with Adult Protective Services detailing severe elder neglect and physical abuse. The lead officer leaned over the table, his eyes scanning the medical report. I watched the aggressive, authoritative posture drain out of his shoulders as he read the horrific clinical details. He looked at the high-resolution photographs the hospital had taken of her bruised wrists and festering bed sores. His jaw went slack. Your mother claimed she was at a premier luxury care center. The officer muttered, his voice losing its harsh edge. She said you dragged her out of a specialized medical environment. My mother lied to you, officer, I replied smoothly, sliding the next document across the polished wood. Here is the legally binding, irrevocable living trust and the authentic, durable power of attorney. These documents were drafted and notarized 3 years ago. My grandmother granted me full, absolute legal and medical authority over her life. She explicitly stripped my mother of all rights because she knew my mother was going to try and steal her assets. The second officer leaned in, examining the raised notary seal on the parchment paper. So Sharon has no legal standing, the officer asked, looking up at me with dawning realization. She filed a false police report this morning. Filing a false police report is the absolute least of her crimes, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. I am a senior forensic accountant, and I have spent the last 12 hours conducting a massive financial audit. I flipped to the thickest section of the binder and spread the bank statements across the table. I pointed to the highlighted routing numbers and the forged, canceled checks. My mother isolated my grandmother in a decaying state ward specifically to steal her massive corporate pension. She forged my grandmother's signature on these checks for over 2 years. She embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars, crossing state lines to funnel the cash into a secondary shell account. The officers stared at the paper trail, their eyes widening as the sheer scale of the theft became apparent. The neat columns of numbers, the highlighted routing digits, the undeniable proof of systematic financial exploitation lay perfectly organized before them. But she did not stop there. I continued pulling out the final piece of evidence. I slid the digital closing documents and the metadata extraction report toward the center of the table. Last month, my mother fraudulently sold my grandmother's vintage estate in the Berkshires. She used a corrupt lawyer to bypass the anti-money laundering protocols. This metadata proves that the fraudulent closing documents were created and signed from my mother's personal IP address. The exact total of the sale, $850,000, was wired directly into an escrow account. That escrow account funded the down payment for my sister Courtney's new $1.5 million mansion. The house she is hosting a massive luxury housewarming party for this coming Saturday. The dining room was completely silent, except for the heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The 2 police officers stood frozen, staring at the mountain of undeniable forensic evidence. They had arrived at my home fully prepared to arrest a mentally unstable kidnapper. Instead, they were looking at a perfectly executed financial autopsy detailing a massive multi-state felony conspiracy. The lead officer slowly picked up the metadata report. He looked at the forged checks, the hospital abuse photographs, and the routing numbers. The realization washed over his face, completely altering his entire demeanor. He looked up at me, the hostility completely gone, replaced by a stark professional gravity. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice hushed. "This is not a domestic dispute. The dollar amounts here, the crossing of state lines, the real estate fraud. This is way above our local jurisdiction." "I know," I replied, holding his gaze. "That is why I organized the binder. I needed you to see the scope of the crime before my mother tried to use you to destroy the evidence." The lead officer turned to his partner. "Cancel the transport unit," he ordered sharply, "and get on the radio to dispatch right now. Tell them to contact the district attorney and reach out to the field office." He looked back at me, his expression grim but respectful. "We are not looking at a kidnapping case here. We are looking at a massive felony fraud syndicate. We are calling in a federal investigator." The transition from local law enforcement to federal authority happened with a swift and terrifying efficiency. Less than an hour after the local police officers radioed their dispatch, a plainclothes agent from the Federal Bureau of Investigation arrived at my front door. Special Agent Harris was a sharp-eyed, pragmatic woman who took one look at my perfectly organized white binder and recognized exactly what kind of monster she was dealing with. I invited her to sit at my dining room table, and I walked her through the massive spreadsheet detailing every forged check, every diverted pension deposit, and the ultimate prize, the fraudulent sale of the vintage Berkshire estate. I explained the digital metadata Arthur Sterling had surrendered, proving unequivocally that my mother had orchestrated the entire closing from her suburban living room computer. But the crucial detail, the element that transformed this from a localized case of elder abuse into a major federal crime, was the specific routing pathway. Sharon had not just stolen the money. She had deliberately moved the embezzled funds across state lines, wiring them from my grandmother's regional Massachusetts credit union directly into a specialized escrow account located in Courtney's upscale Connecticut zip code. That intentional interstate wire transfer activated federal jurisdiction instantly. Agent Harris did not hesitate or ask for clarification. She recognized the flawless nature of the forensic audit. She took immediate custody of the physical binder and secured the encrypted flash drive containing all the digital correspondence and metadata. The local officers formally cleared me of all abduction charges before departing, leaving the federal agent to initiate the immediate takedown of my mother's entire financial empire. I spent the next 48 hours working directly with Agent Harris and the federal prosecutor's office to dismantle the fraudulent infrastructure my mother had built. Because I possessed the authentic and irrevocable power of attorney acting as the sole legal protector of my grandmother's estate, I had the standing to file an emergency injunction alongside the federal warrants. The prosecutors moved aggressively, presenting my meticulous forensic audit to a federal judge. The evidence was so absolute, so flawlessly documented, that the judge granted the emergency asset freeze within minutes. The execution was beautiful in its silent, devastating efficiency. Federal warrants were electronically dispatched to every single banking institution holding accounts under Sharon's or Courtney's names. The freeze did not just target the stolen funds. It completely locked down their personal checking accounts, their shared credit lines, their retirement investment portfolios, and the primary mortgage account linked to Courtney's massive new mansion. Everything was seized pending a full criminal investigation. I sat at my dining room table, nursing a hot cup of tea, feeling a profound sense of justice finally settling over my home. For years, my mother and sister had weaponized money to control and manipulate everyone around them. They used wealth as a shield and a bludgeon. Now that weapon had been completely neutralized. They were financially paralyzed and they did not even know it yet. I walked down the hall and peeked into the guest room. My grandmother was sleeping peacefully, her breathing steady and calm. The dark bruises on her wrists were already beginning to fade. I closed the door quietly and returned to my command center. Thousands of miles away in the snow-dusted luxury of Aspen, my mother was completely oblivious to the legal avalanche crashing down upon her. According to the digital transaction alerts, I could still monitor as the reporting agent she and Courtney were actively shopping. They had spent the entire morning browsing high-end boutiques preparing for Courtney's extravagant upcoming housewarming party. I could easily picture the scene playing out in real time. Sharon projecting an air of aristocratic wealth, marching to a register with an armful of designer clothing and casually handing over a platinum debit card funded entirely by my grandmother's stolen pension. I imagined the slight frown on the cashier's face as the terminal beeped loudly, rejecting the transaction. I pictured Sharon scoffing, visibly annoyed by the inconvenience, aggressively pulling a second credit card from her designer wallet, blaming a bank error or a security hold. But the second card would decline just as loudly. Then the third. Then the frantic, panicked phone calls to their financial institutions, resulting in the exact same automated response, directing them to contact federal authorities regarding a total asset seizure. The realization would hit Sharon like a physical blow. Her perfectly constructed reality, funded by cruelty and theft, was instantly vaporized. She was stranded in an expensive ski resort with a daughter who relied on her for absolutely everything, and suddenly neither of them had access to a single cent. They could not buy a meal, they could not pay their hotel bill, and they certainly could not afford a flight home. The humiliation would be absolute and public. Every perfectly curated social media post they had planned for their glamorous vacation would be replaced by the harsh reality of complete financial ruin. It did not take long for the inevitable phone call to come through. My cell phone vibrated violently against the kitchen counter, displaying Sharon's number. The arrogant, demanding text messages threatening me with arrest had completely stopped. She had finally realized that the police were not coming to save her. She realized the banks had locked her out. She realized I held all the cards. I let the phone ring 4 times, allowing the tension to stretch to its absolute limit before I calmly swiped the screen and answered. Whitney. Oh my God, Whitney, is that you? Sharon's voice crackled through the speaker. There was no trace of the confident bully who had berated me in the family group chat just days prior. She was sobbing hysterically, her breathing ragged and panicked. She sounded exactly like a cornered animal realizing the trap had just snapped shut. I am here, Sharon, I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. You have to fix this. Whitney? She wept, the desperation practically bleeding through the phone line. I am standing in the lobby of our hotel and my cards are declining. Everything is declining. Courtney tried to buy a coffee and her account showed a negative balance. I called the bank and they said there is a federal hold on all of our assets. They said you filed an emergency injunction. Whitney, you have to call them back and tell them it is a misunderstanding. Please, you have to stop this right now. I listened to her beg, feeling a cold satisfaction spreading through my chest. There is no misunderstanding, Sharon, I stated flatly. The federal investigators have my complete forensic audit. They have the metadata from Arthur Sterling proving you forged the closing documents for the Berkshire estate. They have the bank records showing you wired stolen pension funds across state lines. The freeze is permanent pending your criminal indictment. You cannot do this to us, Sharon wailed, dropping the aggressive act entirely and shifting seamlessly into manipulative victimhood. We are blood, Whitney. Don't let the banks do this. I was just trying to help your sister get a start in life. You have always been the independent one. You know how hard it is out there. Courtney is sensitive. She needed a beautiful home to feel secure. I was only trying to provide for her. Do not ruin our lives over this. Her pathetic rationalization made my jaw clench. She was still trying to justify stealing an elderly woman's life savings by framing it as maternal devotion to her golden child. She expected me to fold under the pressure of familial guilt, just like everyone else always did. She expected me to protect her because we shared genetics. You left her in a paper gown so you could buy champagne? I said, my words slicing through her hysterical sobbing like a blade. Blood doesn't mean a thing. Whitney, please, I am begging you, Sharon cried, her voice breaking completely. How are we supposed to get home? How is Courtney going to pay her mortgage? How are we going to survive this? That is a problem for your public defender to solve, I replied coldly. I suggest you find a very good one. See you in court. I hung up the phone and blocked her number permanently. I set the device down and looked down the hallway toward the guest room, where my grandmother was finally resting safely in a warm, clean bed. I stood in the quiet warmth of my home, a stark contrast to the sterile freezing ward where they had abandoned her. The financial autopsy was complete. The authorities had taken absolute control. The digital smear campaign my extended family had waged against me meant absolutely nothing against the crushing weight of a federal indictment. The aunts and uncles who had so eagerly participated in the group chat would soon be receiving subpoenas to testify regarding their own complicity. My mother and sister were stranded penniless and facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The facade of their high society life had been dismantled brick by brick. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, knowing that the trap was definitively and irrevocably locked. I had barely taken my first sip of coffee when my cell phone vibrated again. It was a message from Marcus, the senior managing partner at my forensic accounting firm. Marcus had been my mentor for 8 years. When I first suspected Sharon was siphoning funds, I brought the preliminary banking anomalies directly to his office. Instead of telling me to step back, he had closed his blinds, poured 2 glasses of scotch, and helped me utilize our firm's proprietary tracking software to uncover the shell accounts. We had built the federal case together. His text message simply read, "Check your secure email." I opened the firm portal on my phone and found an audio file attached to a message from his executive assistant. Sharon had called the firm. I pressed play and listened as my mother's shrill, frantic voice echoed through my kitchen. She had demanded to speak with the senior partners, claiming she was a concerned family member calling to report severe professional misconduct. She told the receptionist I was undergoing a massive psychiatric breakdown and had illegally abused my corporate access to harass my own family. She demanded my immediate termination, threatening a massive defamation lawsuit against the entire firm if they did not comply. The recording seamlessly transitioned into Marcus taking the call. His voice was dangerously calm, a stark contrast to Sharon's manufactured hysteria. Mrs. Sterling Marcus had said smoothly, using her maiden name as a deliberate insult. "My firm specializes in exposing financial predators. We hunt corporate embezzlers for sport. Your daughter is our absolute best investigator." I am looking at a copy of the exact same federal audit she handed over to the authorities yesterday. It is flawless. Your threats of a defamation lawsuit are hilarious, considering you will not have the funds to hire a parking ticket lawyer by tomorrow morning. Do not ever contact this firm again. The audio file ended with the sharp click of Marcus hanging up. A follow-up text from him popped onto my screen. "Number blocked. Give them hell, Whitney." The sheer desperation of Sharon's attempt to ruin my career proved just how deeply she was panicking. Her entire worldview relied on the assumption that I was weak and isolated. She never factored in that I had spent the last decade building a formidable professional network of people who valued loyalty and despised fraud. I rinsed my coffee mug in the sink and walked down the hallway toward the guest suite. The private nurse I had hired met me at the door with a warm smile. She handed me a fresh chart detailing normal blood pressure readings and significantly improved hydration levels. She told me the patient was awake and lucid before excusing herself to the kitchen to prepare a light breakfast. I stepped into the room. The morning sunlight filtered softly through the sheer curtains, illuminating the space. Ruth was propped up against a mountain of plush pillows. Her silver hair had been washed and brushed, and she was wearing a soft cashmere sweater I had purchased for her years ago. The dark circles under her eyes were still prominent, but the dull, vacant stare I had witnessed in that horrible state ward was completely gone. Her sharp, intelligent blue eyes locked onto mine the moment I crossed the threshold. She patted the edge of the mattress, gesturing for me to sit down. I sat beside her gently, taking her frail hand in mine. "You look so much better, Grandma," I said, keeping my voice low. "We have the best doctors coming to check on you this afternoon. You are completely safe now." Ruth squeezed my fingers with a surprising amount of strength. "I knew you would come, Whitney." she said, her voice raspy, but entirely clear. I knew it would take you a little while to figure out the puzzle, but I never doubted you for a second. I frowned, slightly confused by her words. The puzzle, I asked. Grandma Sharon hid everything. She forged your signature. She locked you away. I did not know until I forced my way into the bank vault. Ruth let out a dry, raspy chuckle that turned into a brief cough. I knew exactly what Sharon was doing, she said, shocking me into absolute silence. I knew she was circling like a vulture the moment your grandfather passed away. She always hated that I controlled the primary estate. She thought she deserved the Berkshire property the moment she turned 40. I wanted to see exactly how far she would go. I wanted to see who she truly was. I stared at her, trying to process the magnitude of what she was saying. You let her put you in that awful facility, I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of horror and awe. You let her steal the pension funds. I played weak, Ruth stated firmly. I played broke and confused. I signed a few preliminary papers to make her feel secure, to make her think she had won. But I secured the real, irrevocable power of attorney with you 3 years ago. I hid the true extent of the primary offshore trust accounts. Sharon thought she was draining my entire life savings, but she was only scratching the surface of the dummy accounts I left exposed. I needed to see if she would choose greed over her own mother. And she did. She took the bait. She bought that ridiculous girl a mansion with money she thought was my last dime. She threw me into a freezing ward without a second thought. Ruth reached up and cupped my cheek, her thumb gently brushing away a stray tear I had not realized was falling. But I also needed to see if you had the spine to stop her. Ruth continued, her eyes blazing with a fierce, unyielding light. You have always been so smart, Whitney, but you always let them walk all over you at dinner parties. You always took the high road while they threw mud. The high road does not stop predators. I needed you to find your teeth. I needed you to track the money, find the fraud, and burn their little fantasy world to the ground. You are the only one in this family with the integrity to manage the real estate. I sat there absorbing the sheer brilliant ruthlessness of my grandmother. She had orchestrated a massive high-stakes loyalty test using her own comfort as the ultimate bait. She had allowed Sharon to hang herself with a rope woven entirely of her own greed. And she had forced me to finally step out of my role as the passive punching bag and become the architect of their destruction. I pulled the federal injunction paperwork from my pocket and placed it on her lap. The authorities have frozen everything I told her. The Berkshire's property sale has been flagged for federal wire fraud. Sharon's accounts are locked. Courtney has no access to the funds for her mortgage. Arthur Sterling has flipped and provided the FBI with all the metadata proving Sharon forged the final closing documents from her living room. They are currently stranded in Aspen, with declining credit cards and a federal investigation waiting for them the second they land. Ruth looked down at the legal documents. A slow, sharp smile spread across her weathered face. It was a terrifying, beautiful smile. She looked up at me, her eyes gleaming with absolute triumph. They are hosting that ridiculous housewarming party today. Are they not? She asked. I nodded. Courtney sent the invitations out months ago. Half the city elite are expected to be there to celebrate her massive new real estate purchase. They are flying back this morning specifically to host it. They think they can still salvage the situation. They think I am bluffing about the receipts. Ruth squeezed my hand and leaned back against her pillows. Take back what is ours, sweetheart, she commanded, her voice ringing with authority. Do not leave their pride intact. I stood up, feeling pure adrenaline coursing through my veins. The timid sister who used to accept their insults evaporated completely. I walked into my bedroom and opened my closet. I bypassed the conservative suits I normally wore to the office. This was not a business meeting. This was a long overdue execution. I selected a tailored emerald green dress that fit perfectly, projecting power and absolute confidence. I paired it with sleek black stilettos and applied a bold crimson lipstick I usually saved for major celebrations. I walked over to my desk and picked up the thick white binder containing the forensic audit. I placed the heavily documented evidence into a leather tote bag alongside my phone and keys. I checked my reflection in the mirror one last time. The woman staring back was no longer the family scapegoat. She was the rightful executor ready to crash the most exclusive party of the season. I drove the 45 minutes to the exclusive gated community in complete silence. My mind was razor sharp processing the precise timeline of the federal warrants currently snaking through the banking system. The winding roads of Courtney's new neighborhood were lined with towering oaks and massive stone privacy walls that projected an aura of impenetrable wealth. As I approached the address, the sheer scale of the theft became physically apparent, making my grip tighten on the steering wheel. The property was a sprawling modern architectural marvel, featuring massive glass panels and a sweeping circular driveway. A private valet service managed the overflow of luxury vehicles belonging to the guests. I pulled my modest sedan up to the curb. I handed my keys to a valet, smoothly ignoring his slight hesitation as he took in my vehicle surrounded by imported sports cars. I adjusted the strap of my leather tote bag, the weight of the forensic evidence pressing against my hip, and walked up the slate steps toward the double mahogany doors. The thumping bass of a live jazz band spilled onto the front porch, mingling with the sounds of wealthy people laughing and clinking glasses. They were inside celebrating a glamorous life built entirely on the suffering of an 82-year-old woman left to rot in a paper gown. I pushed the heavy doors open and stepped inside. The interior of the mansion was even more extravagant. Courtney had clearly spared absolutely no expense hiring a premier event planner to orchestrate her grand debut into high society. Waitstaff in crisp black uniforms circulated effortlessly through the massive open-concept living space, carrying polished silver trays loaded with tall champagne flutes and delicate caviar appetizers. A towering, intricately carved ice sculpture anchored a lavish seafood raw bar in the center of the formal dining room. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over the guests, who were mingling, admiring the vaulted ceilings and the panoramic views of the heated infinity pool in the backyard. I moved slowly through the crowded foyer, my tailored emerald green dress and sharp crimson lipstick serving as perfect armor against the curious glancing eyes of strangers. I recognized several faces immediately. There was my Uncle David holding a heavy Scotch glass and laughing loudly with a local politician. My Aunt Barbara was standing near the grand sweeping staircase draped in expensive jewelry, admiring a large modern art installation hanging on the wall. These were the exact same people who had eagerly torn me to shreds in the family group chat just days prior. They had blindly accepted Sharon's fabricated narrative without a single question, perfectly content to label me a deranged, jealous spinster, as long as it kept them in my mother's good graces, and invited to lavish parties exactly like this one. I did not avert my eyes when Aunt Barbara finally spotted me through the crowd. I held her gaze with absolute icy calm until her polite, social smile completely faltered, and she nervously turned away to whisper urgently to the woman standing next to her. I was not here for the extended family today. They were merely the audience. They were the collateral damage in the impending blast radius of my mother's destruction. I continued my deliberate, unhurried path toward the back patio where the largest cluster of guests had gathered. The backyard was an absolute masterpiece of stolen wealth and misplaced vanity. A massive outdoor kitchen complete with dual custom pizza ovens, a built-in grill, and a marble wet bar flanked the edge of the turquoise infinity pool. Dozens of guests were lounging on plush white cabana sofas sipping expensive, colorful cocktails under the bright afternoon sun. And right in the center of it all, holding court with a glass of vintage champagne, was my mother. Sharon was wearing a pristine white designer jumpsuit, her hair perfectly blown out, looking every inch the wealthy, benevolent matriarch she desperately pretended to be. Standing right beside her was Courtney, draped in a shimmering gold dress, laughing brightly at a joke told by one of her affluent new neighbors. They looked completely unbothered, entirely confident in their stolen reality. They had assumed my silence over the past 48 hours meant I had surrendered to their pressure. They thought their aggressive police stunt at my townhouse had terrified me into submission. They genuinely believed that their declining debit cards in Aspen were just a temporary banking glitch, a minor inconvenience they would sort out with an angry phone call on Monday morning. They had absolutely no idea that a federal investigator was currently dismantling their entire financial existence. I stepped onto the patio, my black stilettos clicking sharply against the imported stone tiles. The sound was barely audible over the jazz band, but the ripple effect of my presence was immediate. As I parted the crowd walking with an unhurried, absolute certainty, conversations began to die out. Heads turned. The whispering started rippling through the wealthy guests like a sudden cold breeze. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my eyes locked directly on my mother and sister. It took Sharon exactly 10 seconds to register the sudden shift in the crowd's attention. She turned her head, her polite social smile freezing instantly as she saw me approaching. Courtney's laughter died in her throat, her champagne glass hovering inches from her lips. For a fraction of a second I saw genuine raw panic flash across their faces. But they were surrounded by their elite friends and their enabling relatives. Their arrogance immediately overrode their fear. They genuinely believed they still held the absolute power in our family dynamic. They thought they could use the public audience to shame me into retreating, just as they had done my entire life. Sharon squared her shoulders and plastered on a condescending smirk, stepping forward to intercept me before I could reach the center of the patio. Courtney followed closely behind her, emboldened by the presence of her wealthy guests. "Look who decided to crawl back!" Courtney sneered loudly, her voice projecting clearly over the sudden quiet of the patio. She pitched her tone perfectly, ensuring that every single person within a 30-foot radius could hear her. "Are you here to beg for a loan? Or did you come to ruin my day again because you cannot stand seeing me happy? I heard you had a complete mental breakdown this week and tried to kidnap grandmother out of pure spite. Have you finally realized you have absolutely nothing without our help?" The sheer audacity of the comment caused a few of the surrounding guests to chuckle nervously, shifting their weight as they watched the family drama unfold. Aunt Barbara and Uncle David had moved closer to the patio doors, watching the confrontation with smug anticipation. They were waiting for me to shrink away, to burst into tears, or to launch into a defensive screaming match that would only prove Sharon's narrative of my mental instability. They wanted a show, and Courtney was eager to provide it. Sharon let out a theatrical sigh, shaking her head with an expression of profound manufactured pity. "Whitney, I told you on the phone that we are done tolerating your erratic behavior," she said, her voice dripping with fake maternal concern. "Showing up uninvited to your sister's housewarming party after the absolute stunt you pulled with the police this week is completely unacceptable. We are trying to celebrate a beautiful milestone today. I know you are struggling financially and emotionally, but you cannot keep projecting your bitter failures onto Courtney's success. If you need money for psychiatric therapy, we can discuss it privately on Monday, but you need to leave this property right now before I have security escort you out." The crowd watched in breathless silence, waiting for my inevitable breakdown. They expected a desperate defense. They expected me to yell or cry or frantically beg for validation from people who despised me. I did none of those things. I simply stood there absorbing their vicious public attacks with complete and utter serenity. The heavy leather tote bag rested comfortably against my hip, carrying the absolute destruction of their entire world. I looked at the extravagant pool, the catered seafood bar, the crystal champagne flutes, and then directly into my mother's eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I let a slow, sharp smile spread across my face, mirroring the exact expression my grandmother had worn that morning. I casually raised my left arm and checked my watch, noting that it was exactly 2:15. The federal banking injunction had just gone entirely public. "I am not here for a loan," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal clarity that caused the smug smirk to instantly vanish from Courtney's face. I stared at the two women who had tormented me my entire life and delivered the final blow. "I am here for the eviction." The word hung in the humid afternoon air, perfectly contrasting the lively jazz music that continued to play from the corner of the patio. Courtney stared at me, her mouth slightly open as her brain struggled to process the sheer absurdity of my statement. She looked down at her shimmering gold dress and then around at the sprawling multi-million-dollar estate she claimed to own. A sharp barking laugh erupted from her throat. It was a harsh grating sound devoid of any genuine amusement. Eviction, Courtney repeated, her voice dripping with absolute venomous disbelief. You really have lost your mind, Whitney. You are standing in the middle of my custom-built backyard, surrounded by my successful friends talking about an eviction. I own this property free and clear. I closed on it last month. You are pathetic. You are so jealous of my life that you have literally driven yourself insane. Sharon quickly stepped in, sensing the subtle shift in the crowd's energy. The wealthy guests were no longer just casually observing a minor family squabble. They were leaning forward, their expressions tight with morbid fascination. Sharon knew she had to shut this down immediately before the spectacle ruined her carefully curated social standing. All right, that is enough, Sharon said, her voice loud and artificially steady. She let out a short, nervous laugh, waving her hand toward the guests in a placating gesture. I apologize, everyone. My older daughter is clearly experiencing a severe psychiatric episode. She has been under a lot of stress lately, and unfortunately, she has decided to act out her delusions in public. Please just ignore her. We will handle this privately. Sharon turned her back to the crowd and glared at me, her eyes dark with a familiar, terrifying rage. The polite facade was completely gone, replaced by the vicious, controlling matriarch who had dictated my entire existence. She raised her hand and snapped her fingers sharply, signaling the two large private security guards she had hired to monitor the front gate. "Grab her!" Sharon ordered the guards, her voice dropping into a harsh guttural whisper intended only for me. "Grab her by the arms and drag her out the back service gate. Do not let her make another sound. If she tries to scream, put your hands over her mouth and physically throw her off this property." The two security men wearing tight black polo shirts and earpieces stepped forward immediately. They were massive, intimidating figures accustomed to handling unruly party guests with swift physical force. They approached me from opposite sides, their expressions blank and professional, fully prepared to grab my shoulders and forcefully march me off the patio. I did not flinch. I did not step back or raise my hands in defense. I simply held Sharon's furious gaze, maintaining my serene smile, and gracefully stepped one single pace to the right, perfectly clearing the pathway from the mansion interior to the outdoor patio. "You cannot throw me out, Sharon," I said, my voice soft but incredibly sharp. "Because I did not come alone." The heavy glass patio doors slid open with a sharp, violent crack that echoed across the stone tiles. The two private security guards stopped dead in their tracks, their hands hovering inches from my arms. They turned their heads toward the doors, and their professional, aggressive demeanor vanished instantly. Special Agent Harris stepped onto the patio. She was dressed in a sharp, dark suit, her posture radiating an overwhelming, undeniable authority that instantly dwarfed the superficial wealth of the party. Flanking her was a second federal agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a severe expression, and a local process server carrying a thick stack of legal documents enclosed in heavy blue folders. Agent Harris did not bother with pleasantries. She reached into her suit jacket and smoothly produced her federal badge, holding it up high enough for the entire patio to see the gleaming gold shield. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." Agent Harris announced, her voice booming across the sudden absolute silence of the backyard. The jazz band immediately stopped playing mid-note. The bartender froze, holding a cocktail shaker in mid-air. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The entire party was paralyzed. Agent Harris locked her eyes on the two private security guards, who were still standing uncomfortably close to me. "Step away from her right now," the agent commanded, pointing a sharp finger at the men. "If you touch her, you will be arrested for interfering with a federal investigation." The guards practically tripped over themselves, scrambling backward, raising their hands in the air to show complete compliance. They faded into the crowd, wanting absolutely nothing to do with federal authorities. Sharon stood frozen, her artificial smile completely wiped away. The color drained rapidly from her face, leaving her skin a sickly pale hue. Courtney dropped her champagne flute. The expensive crystal shattered against the stone tiles, sending a splash of imported liquor across her designer shoes, but she did not even look down. "What is the meaning of this?" Sharon stammered, her voice trembling uncontrollably. "You have no jurisdiction here. This is a private residence. We are hosting a private event. You do not own this residence." "Mrs. Sterling," Agent Harris replied coldly, stepping directly into the center of the patio. "This property was purchased using funds obtained through major interstate wire fraud. The entire estate is currently seized under federal authority." The collective gasp from the high society crowd was audible. The wealthy neighbors, the local politicians, the elite socialites who had happily accepted free champagne and expensive catered food suddenly realized they were standing in the middle of a massive federal crime scene. They began shifting nervously, casting suspicious, alarmed glances toward Sharon and Courtney. The illusion of the perfect, successful family had just violently shattered. I stepped forward, moving past the federal agents to address the dead silent room. My voice carried easily across the patio, ringing with absolute, undeniable truth. "This entire house," I announced, gesturing toward the sprawling mansion, the custom pool, and the extravagant outdoor kitchen, was bought with stolen money. The catering you are eating, the vintage champagne you are drinking, the designer clothes my mother and sister are wearing right now, were all funded by a massive multi-state embezzlement scheme." "Whitney, shut up!" Sharon shrieked, her voice breaking into a hysterical pitch. She lunged forward, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Do not listen to her. She is lying. She is completely insane." I did not raise my voice to match her panic. I simply continued speaking to the horrified guests, my tone icy and precise. My mother and sister systematically isolated my 82-year-old grandmother in a decaying, abusive state-run medical ward. They locked her in a freezing room and left her sitting in a soiled paper gown so they could drain her entire corporate pension and steal her life savings. They forged her signature on dozens of checks, transferring hundreds of thousands of dollars across state lines specifically to pay for this extravagant party and this fraudulent house. Courtney let out a strangled, sobbing gasp, shaking her head wildly. "No!" she cried out, grabbing Sharon's arm. "Mom, tell them she is lying. Tell them it is our money. Mom, do something." But Sharon could not do anything. She was staring at Agent Harris, her chest heaving as the reality of her total destruction finally set in. The process server stepped forward, bypassing Sharon entirely, and walked directly up to Courtney. He held out the thick stack of blue legal folders. "Courtney Sterling," he said, his voice loud and formal. "You are hereby served with a federal asset freeze and an immediate order of eviction. You have exactly 1 hour to collect a single bag of personal necessities before federal agents secure the property and change the locks. You are required to vacate the premises immediately." He shoved the documents directly against Courtney's chest. She instinctively brought her arms up to catch them, clutching the heavy folders as if they were physically burning her. She looked down at the bold black letters spelling out the federal injunction. The reality of the situation crashed down upon her. She was losing the mansion. She was losing her money. She was losing her entire identity. Courtney collapsed onto the stone tiles, sobbing hysterically, the legal papers scattering around her knees. The wealthy guests were completely horrified. These were people who valued reputation and social standing above all else. They abhorred public scandal, and they were currently trapped in the epicenter of a massive federal fraud raid. They began whispering furiously to one another, pulling out their cell phones, eyeing the exits. They wanted to distance themselves from Sharon and Courtney as quickly as humanly possible. But I was not finished. I refused to let my mother spin this later as a misunderstanding or a temporary legal glitch. I needed these people to see the absolute, undeniable truth of who Sharon Sterling really was. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out the thick stack of high-quality color copies I had prepared earlier that morning. I held up the documents displaying the clear, undeniable proof of my mother's crimes. I did not just make accusations, I brought the receipts. I walked toward the closest group of high society guests. They were a cluster of affluent women wearing expensive sundresses who had been laughing with Sharon just 10 minutes prior. I extended my hand, offering them the copies. Here is the medical report from Chicago Premier Research Hospital, detailing my grandmother's severe neglect and malnutrition, I said, sliding the papers into their hesitant hands. Here are the bank ledgers showing the stolen pension funds moving directly from a Massachusetts credit union into Courtney's Connecticut escrow account. And here are the forged checks clearly showing my mother's handwriting, completely faking my grandmother's signature. The women stared down at the documents, their eyes scanning the highlighted routing numbers, the horrific medical photographs, and the glaringly obvious forged signatures. The physical evidence made the crime visceral and real. They were looking at the absolute undeniable proof of systematic elder abuse and massive financial theft. I moved through the crowd smoothly, passing the damning copies to the local politician, the neighborhood association president, and the wealthy doctors who lived next door. Every single person who took the papers reacted with the exact same sequence of emotions. Curiosity followed by dawning comprehension, followed by absolute visceral disgust. They looked at the forged documents, and then looked over at Sharon, who was standing paralyzed in the center of the patio. The reaction was immediate and entirely physical. The high society friends, the people Sharon had spent months aggressively courting and impressing, began to physically back away from her. They stepped backward, their faces twisted in revulsion, treating my mother and sister as if they were suddenly contagious. Nobody offered sympathy. Nobody rushed forward to help Courtney, who was still weeping on the ground. They just backed away, creating a massive empty circle around the two women. Sharon looked around wildly, seeking a friendly face, seeking anyone who would validate her, who would tell her it was going to be okay. But she found absolutely nothing but cold, disgusted stares. The wealthy elite she had stolen to impress were actively abandoning her, recognizing that associating with a federal criminal was social suicide. The trap had not just closed, it had publicly humiliated them in front of the only audience they ever cared about. They were entirely exposed. The patio remained locked in a suffocating silence, broken only by the rhythmic splashing of the infinity pool filter and the heavy, frantic breathing of my sister. Courtney remained on the stone tiles, clutching the federal injunction papers against her chest, as if her manic grip could somehow absorb the ink and erase the reality of her situation. She looked down at the documents again, her eyes frantically darting across the bold black text that explicitly outlined the seizure of the property, the freezing of her bank accounts, and the immediate eviction order. I watched her perfectly manicured nails dig into the thick blue folders, crinkling the heavy paper. The cognitive dissonance was breaking her brain. For 32 years, Courtney had floated through life completely insulated from consequences. Whenever she broke a rule, overspent an allowance, or damaged a relationship, our mother was always there to write a check offer, an excuse, or shift the blame onto someone else, usually me. But Sharon could not write a check to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Sharon could not manipulate a federal asset freeze. The impenetrable bubble of privilege had violently popped, and Courtney was experiencing the brutal exposure of the real world for the very first time. Courtney slowly raised her head from the documents. She did not look at me. She did not look at the disgusted high society guests who were still actively backing away toward the manicured lawn. She looked directly at our mother. The absolute terror in Courtney's eyes rapidly mutated into something entirely different. It morphed into a primal, desperate instinct for self-preservation. The golden child was cornered, and she was fully prepared to gnaw her own leg off to escape the trap. "She did it!" Courtney screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet afternoon air like a siren. She scrambled to her feet, the shimmering gold fabric of her designer dress catching the sunlight as she pointed a shaking, accusatory finger squarely at Sharon's chest. "I had absolutely nothing to do with any of this. I swear to God I did not know where the money came from." Sharon physically recoiled, as if she had just been struck across the face with a lead pipe. Her jaw dropped open, her eyes widening in absolute disbelief. The woman who had sacrificed her own mother to provide a life of luxury for her favorite daughter was now watching that same daughter throw her directly into the path of a speeding freight train. "Courtney, what are you saying?" Sharon gasped, reaching a trembling hand out toward her. Sweetheart, please stop talking. Do not say another word to these people. Do not tell me to stop talking, Courtney shrieked, slapping Sharon's hand away with a violent, frantic gesture. She turned her panicked gaze toward Agent Harris and the second federal investigator, her hands clasped together in a desperate pleading motion. You have to believe me, officers. You cannot take my house. I did not forge any signatures. I did not lock my grandmother in a facility. That was all her doing. She told me the money was from an early inheritance. She told me grandmother wanted me to have the down payment for this mansion. I am a victim here. She lied to me. She orchestrated the entire real estate closing. I just signed where she told me to sign. You cannot punish me for her crimes. The sheer velocity of Courtney's betrayal was breathtaking to witness. She was shedding her loyalty faster than a snake shedding its skin, offering up our mother on a silver platter to save her own lavish lifestyle. She was fully prepared to let Sharon rot in a federal penitentiary if it meant she could keep her custom kitchen and her luxury zip code. The profound shock on Sharon's face instantly melted away. The maternal devotion, the fierce protective instinct that had driven her to commit elder abuse and massive financial fraud evaporated in the blink of an eye. In its place rose a toxic, volcanic rage. Sharon was a narcissist to her absolute core, and a narcissist cannot tolerate being publicly humiliated, let alone betrayed by the very person they had sacrificed their soul to elevate. If Sharon was going to sink, she was absolutely going to drag Courtney down into the dark water with her. You ungrateful, vicious little brat, Sharon roared, stepping forward and closing the distance between them. The polite, aristocratic facade she had spent decades cultivating was entirely gone, leaving behind a snarling, vicious predator. How dare you stand there and play the innocent victim? You knew exactly where every single dime of that money came from. I did not. Courtney cried out, taking a step backward. I thought it was an investment payout. Do not insult my intelligence and do not lie to the federal government, Sharon screamed, pointing furiously at the sprawling mansion behind them. You drove me insane for 6 months whining about needing a house that rivaled your country club friends. You sent me dozens of real estate listings you could not afford, demanding I find a way to finance your delusions of grandeur. When the bank denied your mortgage application, you sat in my kitchen crying until I promised to fix it. I told you exactly what I was doing to get that cash. I told you I had to liquidate the Berkshire estate to fund the escrow account, and you told me to do whatever it took to get the keys to this property. Courtney shook her head wildly, tears streaming down her face, ruining her flawless makeup. No, I never told you to forge her name. I never told you to leave her in a state ward. You literally helped me pick the facility. Sharon fired back, her voice echoing off the stone privacy walls of the backyard. You sat on the couch with your laptop scrolling through the cheapest state-run nursing homes in the region, looking for the one with the lowest monthly fee so we could maximize the cash flow for your closing costs. You complained that spending anything more than the absolute minimum on her care was taking money directly out of your interior design budget. You picked the facility, Courtney. You knew the conditions, and you did not care as long as you got your imported marble countertops and your infinity pool. The guests were completely paralyzed, frozen in a state of absolute horror as they watched the mother and daughter verbally eviscerate each other. They were openly detailing the exact mechanics of their felony conspiracy, loudly providing the federal agents with a spontaneous, unprompted joint confession. They were mutually destroying each other's alibis, burning down their remaining defenses out of pure spite and vindictive rage. I did what any mother would do, Sharon yelled, turning her wild gaze toward the crowd, seeking any shred of sympathy but finding only revulsion. I provided for my child. I gave her the world, and this is how she repays me. By feeding me to the wolves, the second things get difficult. You ruined my life! Courtney sobbed, dropping to her knees on the patio. You promised me this house was safe. You promised me nobody would ever find out. You said Whitney was too stupid to ever look at the trust accounts. You told me we were protected. Agent Harris, who had been standing perfectly still, allowing the two women to incriminate themselves on the record, finally stepped forward. The sharp authority in her movement instantly silenced the screaming match. She looked at the second agent and gave a short, decisive nod. Sharon Sterling. Agent Harris said, her voice cutting through the thick, humid air like a scythe. Based on the forensic evidence provided to the Bureau and your own verbal admissions here today, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, interstate embezzlement, and the severe endangerment and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The second agent moved with terrifying speed and efficiency. Before Sharon could even process the words, he grabbed her wrist, twisted her arms smoothly behind her back, and clamped a heavy steel handcuff around her wrist. The sharp metallic click echoed loudly across the patio. "Wait!" Sharon gasped, her eyes widening in sudden, absolute terror as the reality of the handcuffs finally registered. "No, wait, you cannot do this. I am a respected member of this community. You cannot arrest me at a party. I have lawyers. I demand to speak to my lawyers. You will have plenty of time to make phone calls from the holding cell," Mrs. Sterling. Agent Harris replied, pulling a Miranda rights card from her pocket. "You have the right to remain silent. Based on the last 5 minutes, I highly recommend you start using it. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the federal agent continued reciting her rights, Sharon began to thrash, fighting against the iron grip of the investigator. The elegant white designer jumpsuit twisted awkwardly as she struggled, losing her balance and stumbling on her expensive heels. It was a pathetic, undignified display. The guests who had eagerly accepted her invitations and drank her stolen champagne were now scrambling toward the side gates, treating the patio like the deck of a sinking ship. The exodus was instantaneous and chaotic. High society socialites, wealthy neighbors, and local politicians abandoned their plates of catered food and dropped their crystal glasses, hurrying across the manicured lawn to escape the property. They did not want to be questioned. They did not want to be associated with a high-profile federal arrest. They fled the crime scene, leaving their expensive cars with the valet and calling private drivers from the street. The jazz band hastily packed their instruments, abandoning their set list and scurrying out the back gate. Within 3 minutes, the lavish housewarming party was completely dismantled. The sprawling backyard was entirely deserted save for the federal agents, the process server, myself, and the 2 ruined women. Agent Harris nodded to her partner, who began forcefully marching a sobbing, struggling Sharon across the patio toward the side entrance of the estate. Sharon twisted her head back, looking at me with an expression of pure, unfiltered hatred. "You did this to us, Whitney," she screamed, her voice cracking. "You destroyed your own family. You are a monster." I did not flinch. I stood perfectly still, watching the agents drag the woman who had tormented me my entire life off the property. The heavy wooden gate slammed shut behind them, severing the connection completely. The silence that fell over the backyard was heavy and absolute, broken only by the pathetic sound of Courtney crying. I looked down at my sister. She was sitting in a puddle of spilled champagne on the stone patio, surrounded by the discarded federal eviction notices. The shimmering gold dress was stained and ruined. The grand mansion looming behind her, the symbol of her ultimate victory over me, no longer belonged to her. The bank accounts were frozen. The guests had abandoned her. Her mother was in the back of a federal vehicle. She had absolutely nothing left. Courtney looked up at me, her face streaked with mascara, her eyes red and swollen. She opened her mouth, perhaps to launch another insult, perhaps to beg for mercy, but she found nothing to say. She simply stared at me, realizing with absolute crushing clarity that the quiet sister she had underestimated her entire life had meticulously and flawlessly orchestrated her complete destruction. I did not offer a comforting word. I did not smile or gloat. The financial autopsy was complete. The cancer had been entirely excised. I adjusted the strap of my leather tote bag, turned my back on the weeping girl on the patio, and walked smoothly out of the mansion, leaving her alone with the ruins of her stolen life. The drive back to my townhouse was the most peaceful commute of my entire life. The heavy, oppressive weight that had suffocated me for 32 years was gone, left behind on the wet stone patio of a seized mansion. Over the next 3 days, the fallout from the federal raid swept through my extended family like a catastrophic seismic wave. The local news channels picked up the story of the high society arrest, broadcasting footage of my mother being guided into a federal vehicle in handcuffs. The spectacle was impossible to hide, and the resulting panic within the family ranks was immediate and thoroughly predictable. My cell phone, which had been practically silent since I walked out of the housewarming party, suddenly became the most popular device in the state. The infamous family group chat, that same digital space where my aunts and uncles had enthusiastically joined Sharon in tearing me apart just a week prior, suddenly transformed into a forum of desperate groveling. They had witnessed the federal agents seize everything. They had seen the irrefutable forensic evidence I handed them on printed paper. They knew Sharon was sitting in a federal holding cell awaiting a bail hearing she could not afford to pay. Most importantly, they had finally connected the dots and realized that I was now the sole executor of my grandmother's remaining estate. The $3 million offshore trust that Sharon had failed to drain was entirely under my strict control. The realization sparked a pathetic stampede of backtracking. Aunt Barbara was the first to attempt a reconciliation. Her messages flooded my screen in rapid succession, pinging loudly. She claimed she had been completely blinded by Sharon's lies and manipulations. She swore she never would have said those cruel things if she had known the absolute truth about the forged documents. She insisted we needed to stick together as a loyal family during this incredibly difficult time. Uncle David followed less than an hour later with a long, rambling voice message blaming his poor judgment on the expensive scotch he had been drinking and emphasizing how much he had always respected my accounting career from the very beginning. Their sudden fake affection was absolutely nauseating to witness after all these years. They were not sorry for the relentless verbal abuse they had hurled at me. They were not sorry that my grandmother had been left to rot in a freezing state ward alone. They were only sorry that they had blindly backed the losing horse. Their apologies quickly and inevitably pivoted to their true financial motivation. Aunt Barbara casually mentioned that her youngest son was struggling with his college tuition and asked if Ruth might want to generously contribute from her secured trust. Uncle David hinted heavily that his business was facing a minor cash flow issue and wondered if the family estate could offer a short-term bridge loan now that the federal freeze had secured the remaining assets. They genuinely believed that a few hollow apologies would instantly grant them unlimited access to the $3 million sitting in the bank. I sat at my wide dining room table reading their pathetic, transparent requests and felt absolutely nothing but cold, hard resolve. I did not type out an angry, defensive response. I did not demand apologies or explanations. I simply forwarded every single message and voicemail directly to the powerful legal team I had retained alongside the federal investigators. I instructed my corporate attorneys to immediately draft comprehensive cease and desist orders for every single member of the extended family who had actively participated in the online harassment. The binding legal documents were explicitly clear and incredibly harsh. Any further attempt to contact me or my grandmother, either digitally or physically, would result in immediate harassment charges and potential inclusion in the ongoing federal fraud conspiracy investigation. I permanently blocked every single one of their personal phone numbers across all my private devices. I deleted the family group chat, permanently erasing their digital existence. The established boundary was not a polite request. It was an irreversible concrete wall. They had deliberately chosen to align themselves with a vicious predator, and now they would suffer the social and financial consequences of that terrible choice entirely on their own. With the toxic elements of my family completely severed, I focused my entire energy on my grandmother's recovery. The townhouse was transformed into a state-of-the-art medical sanctuary. I utilized a portion of the newly secured trust to hire a boutique private home care agency. A rotation of elite registered nurses and physical therapists provided round-the-clock care, making sure she was never alone. The spare bedroom on the first floor became a bright, comfortable suite, equipped with a premium adjustable bed, medical-grade monitoring equipment, and a direct communication line to a top-tier geriatric specialist. I spared absolutely no expense to guarantee her comfort. But excellent medical care was only half of the equation. Security was equally paramount. I knew my relatives well enough to understand that profound financial desperation makes greedy people highly unpredictable and dangerous. I hired a private security firm to upgrade the entire perimeter of my property. High-resolution cameras were installed at every entrance feeding directly to my smartphone and the private nursing station monitor. I provided the security company and the nursing staff with a strict, unyielding directive. No one matching the names or descriptions of my extended family was allowed on the premises under any circumstances whatsoever. If Aunt Barbara or Uncle David attempted to bypass the front gates, the local police were to be called immediately to enforce the restraining orders. Ruth thrived in this new protected environment. The severe malnutrition and dehydration she had suffered in the state facility were slowly and successfully reversed. The dark bruises faded from her skin, and her sharp, witty personality returned in full force. We spent our evenings sitting together in the living room, drinking expensive tea and watching the sunset through the large bay windows. She never once asked about Sharon or Courtney. She knew exactly where they belonged, and she was perfectly content to leave them there to face the devastating consequences of their actions. It was late on a Thursday evening, exactly 12 days after the dramatic housewarming raid, when my phone illuminated with an incoming call. The caller ID displayed an unknown local number. I normally ignored unrecognized calls, but given the ongoing federal case, I assumed it might be Agent Harris or the federal prosecutor's office calling with an important update on Sharon's criminal indictment. I answered the call with a crisp, professional greeting. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by a ragged, desperate sobbing sound. "Whitney, please do not hang up," the voice cried out. It was Courtney. She sounded completely unrecognizable. The arrogant, sneering tone she had weaponized her entire life was completely obliterated, replaced by pure terror. She was speaking from a prepaid burner phone. Her voice was shaking violently, and I could hear the loud, chaotic background noise of a busy, rain-slicked street corner. "Whitney, I am begging you, please, you have to help me." Courtney wept, the words tumbling out in a frantic, breathless rush. The federal agents locked the house. They took the luxury cars. My bank accounts are completely frozen. I have absolutely nothing left. I tried calling Mom, but she is still locked in the holding facility, and her high-priced lawyer will not even speak to me. My wealthy friends will not return my calls. Everyone blocked me, Whitney. I have been sleeping in a cheap roadside motel for 2 days, and the money ran out this morning. I am standing outside a convenience store in the freezing, pouring rain. Please, Whitney. I know I was awful to you. I know I said terrible, cruel things, but I am your sister. I have nowhere else to go in this city. Please just let me sleep in your spare bedroom. Just for a few nights until I can figure this out. I will sleep on the hardwood floor. I will do whatever you want. Please, Whitney. I am so incredibly cold and frightened. I stood perfectly still in my warm, brightly lit kitchen, holding the cell phone tightly to my ear. I thought about my elderly grandmother shivering in a soiled paper gown, while Courtney gleefully picked out imported marble countertops with stolen cash. I thought about the decades of unrelenting cruelty they had inflicted upon me. I did not yell. I did not laugh. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the glowing red button, disconnecting the call mid-sentence. I placed the cell phone face down on the granite counter, completely unfazed by her tears. I walked calmly back to the living room to join my grandmother, knowing the trap was now permanently and perfectly closed forever. The morning of my mother's sentencing arrived with a bitter winter chill that seemed perfectly appropriate for the occasion. It was a bleak and unforgiving day. The federal courthouse in downtown Boston was an imposing structure of cold marble and heavy mahogany doors, projecting an aura of absolute consequence. I walked up the steps alone. I walked through the metal detectors with a calm, steady rhythm, my leather briefcase resting comfortably against my shoulder. Inside that briefcase was the culmination of weeks of relentless forensic accounting. Sharon had spent the last several months sitting in a federal holding facility, her previously pristine appearance completely stripped away by the harsh reality of the penal system. Her high-priced defense attorney had desperately tried to secure a plea deal, hoping to minimize the impending prison sentence. As I took my seat in the gallery of the courtroom, I watched my mother being escorted to the defense table. She looked small, fragile, and entirely defeated. The tailored designer suits had been replaced by a drab institutional uniform. Her hair lacked its usual expensive blowout, sitting flat and graying at the roots. When the federal judge entered the courtroom, the atmosphere grew instantly heavy. Sharon's attorney stood and launched into a meticulously rehearsed narrative designed to elicit sympathy. He painted a picture of a desperate mother acting completely out of character. He looked directly at the judge and claimed that the embezzlement of the pension funds was simply a momentary lapse in judgment, a brief tragic moment of weakness brought on by the immense pressure of securing a stable future for her youngest daughter. He argued that Sharon was a pillar of the community who had simply made a terrible mistake under severe financial duress and requested leniency in the form of house arrest and extensive probation. I sat in the second row, completely unfazed by the highly theatrical performance. A moment of weakness implies a sudden, impulsive decision. Massive interstate financial fraud requires dedicated, prolonged calculation and unbelievable deceit. When the federal prosecutor stood to deliver the counter-argument, she did not rely on emotional appeals or grand gestures. She relied entirely on the meticulous paper trail I had painstakingly assembled and handed over to Agent Harris. The prosecutor approached the bench carrying a thick stack of printed ledgers and multiple digital drives. "Your Honor," the prosecutor stated, her voice ringing with absolute clarity. "The defense claims this was a momentary lapse in judgment. However, the forensic accounting proves this was a highly sophisticated, premeditated conspiracy spanning over 8 months." The prosecutor began displaying the digital exhibits on the large monitors positioned around the courtroom. She introduced a series of heavily encrypted files that I had successfully recovered from my mother's seized laptop. For the official court record, the prosecutor announced, "We are submitting 4 specific digital ledgers containing the detailed logs of the fraudulent wire transfers." These ledgers were hidden on the defendant's computer under the exact file names duyenmao1_19.docs and duyenmao2_19.docs. They explicitly outline the precise dates and routing numbers used to siphon money from Ruth Sterling's corporate pension into offshore holding accounts. Furthermore, the prosecutor continued, bringing up the next set of documents. "We submit the fabricated legal authorizations used to isolate the victim in the state facility. These forged medical directives are documented verbatim in the files named duyenmao3_19.docx and duyenmao4_19.docx. They prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that the defendant meticulously planned the physical isolation of her own mother to ensure unchecked access to her financial assets. This was not a moment of weakness. This was a calculated, predatory attack on a highly vulnerable elderly woman." The judge adjusted his glasses, staring intently at the projected evidence. The routing numbers, the forged signatures, the fake medical directives, they were all glaringly undeniable. Sharon shrank lower into her chair, her hands trembling violently on the wooden table. She slowly turned her head and looked back at me in the gallery. There was no defiance left in her eyes. The arrogant, narcissistic matriarch who had controlled our family through fear and financial manipulation was entirely gone. The sheer volume of the evidence had crushed her final desperate attempt to escape total accountability. The judge did not take long to deliberate over the sentencing. He leaned forward, his expression hardening into a mask of absolute judicial severity. "Sharon Sterling," he began, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom. "In my 20 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a case of elder exploitation so callously orchestrated by a direct family member. You weaponized the trust of your own mother to fund a lifestyle of grotesque vanity. You isolated her fabricated legal documents and systematically drained her life savings without a single ounce of remorse until you were finally caught. Your actions demonstrate a profound lack of basic human decency." The judge paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. The defense request for probation is unequivocally denied. For the charges of massive wire fraud, interstate embezzlement, and the severe financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, I sentence you to 180 months in a federal penitentiary with absolutely no possibility of early parole. Furthermore, you are ordered to pay full restitution to the victim. Court is adjourned. The sharp crack of the wooden gavel sounded like a gunshot. A raw, agonizing wail erupted from Sharon's throat. 15 years. She would be an elderly woman herself by the time she saw the outside of a prison wall. The federal marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbing her arms and pulling her forcefully to her feet. She continued to sob uncontrollably as they marched her out of the courtroom through the heavy side doors. I remained in my seat watching until the heavy doors clicked shut behind her. The toxic roots of my family tree had finally been entirely severed. The transition back to daily life felt incredibly bright and expansive. With Sharon locked away and Courtney completely blocked from my existence, the undercurrent of anxiety that had defined my adulthood vanished. Over the next 6 months, my townhouse evolved into a genuine sanctuary of healing. The medical setup I established for my grandmother yielded miraculous results. The private home care nurses worked diligently to restore her physical health, while the safe environment allowed her mental sharpness to fully return. The dark shadows under her eyes faded. Her posture straightened, and the formidable woman who built her corporate pension from nothing slowly reemerged. We spent our time not dwelling on the betrayal, but actively building a new quiet life. We cooked meals in my kitchen, read books in the sunroom, and watched the changing seasons from the comfort of our secure home. The extended family remained completely locked out of our world. The strict legal boundaries held perfectly firm, ensuring no greedy aunt or manipulative uncle could ever bypass our security or disrupt our tranquility. We were completely insulated from their toxic drama and pathetic attempts at reconciliation. It was a beautiful autumn afternoon when the final chapter officially closed. I sat on the wooden balcony of my townhouse sipping hot tea. The glass door slid open and my grandmother stepped out. She wore a thick sweater, her silver hair neatly styled, moving with a steady, confident grace. She carried a heavy leather portfolio, pulling out the chair opposite me to sit down. She placed the portfolio carefully on the glass patio table. "You look beautiful today, Grandma," I said, smiling. She returned the smile, her eyes bright and piercingly clear. "I feel alive, Whitney," she replied, her voice steady. "For the first time, I feel completely in control of my life. But there is one last piece of business we need to handle." She unzipped the portfolio and pulled out a stack of legal documents. It was the finalized master trust agreement drafted by the corporate attorneys. The documents represented the entirety of her massive estate, the $3 million that had survived Sharon's greedy onslaught. "I instructed the lawyers to draft a completely new, irrevocable trust," Ruth explained, sliding the papers across the table. "I am officially restructuring my entire estate. I have legally disinherited every single member of the extended family. They are permanently bypassed. I have signed the entire $3 million estate permanently over to you, Whitney. You are the sole primary beneficiary with complete total control over the assets effective immediately." I stared at the thick stack of legal papers, completely overwhelmed. The absolute, undeniable victory over the people who had tried to destroy us was sitting right there on the table. "Grandma," I whispered, "that is so much money." Ruth reached across the table and placed her warm, steady hand over mine. She smiled, her eyes reflecting a lifetime of hard-won wisdom. She looked at me not as a disappointment, but as her greatest triumph. "You were always the only one worth investing in." The morning after my grandmother signed the trust documents dawned crisp and bright. For the first time in my entire adult life, I woke up without the familiar heavy knot of anxiety sitting in my chest. The sprawling legal battles, the toxic family group chats, the constant suffocating pressure to justify my existence to people who actively despised me had all vanished. They had been replaced by a profound, absolute silence. It was the kind of peace that only comes when you finally stop trying to negotiate with predators. I spent the early hours of the morning reviewing the new portfolio structures with my wealth management team, ensuring that Ruth's medical care and comfort were permanently funded without any possibility of external interference. With the financial transition fully finalized, I decided to step out for my daily morning routine. The affluent neighborhood surrounding my townhouse was coming alive with the familiar rhythm of a busy weekday. Professionals in tailored suits hurried toward the financial district, while dog walkers strolled past the manicured brick facades. I walked down the tree-lined sidewalk, breathing in the sharp, cool autumn air. My destination was a high-end artisanal coffee shop located 3 blocks away, a bustling corner cafe known for imported beans and an aggressively cheerful morning staff. It was a small luxury, a simple routine that grounded my day. I pushed open the heavy glass door of the cafe, stepping into a wall of warm air, heavily scented with espresso and toasted pastries. The morning rush was in full swing. A long line of customers snaked toward the front counter, where a team of baristas worked frantically to keep up with the endless stream of complicated beverage orders. The espresso machines hissed loudly over the low hum of indie music and overlapping conversations. I took my place at the back of the line, casually scrolling through a few emails on my phone. I was entirely relaxed, completely insulated from the chaotic energy of the busy room. I moved forward with the line slowly approaching the main register. The barista working the primary point of sale was keeping her head down furiously, tapping orders into the digital screen while shouting names to the pickup counter. I stepped up to the register, keeping my eyes on my phone as I prepared to order my usual dark roast. "Welcome to What Can I Get Started for You?" The barista asked, her voice completely flat and devoid of any actual warmth. The tone was instantly unmistakable. It was a harsh, grating sound that sent an involuntary ripple of recognition straight down my spine. I slowly lowered my phone and looked across the counter. Standing there, trapped behind the stainless steel register, was Courtney. The sheer physical shock of her deterioration was breathtaking. The glittering golden child who had stood on the patio of a stolen multi-million-dollar mansion just months prior was completely gone. Courtney was wearing a faded, ill-fitting canvas apron covered in dark splotches of spilled coffee and milk stains. The pristine designer clothes she used to flaunt had been replaced by a cheap black polyester polo shirt that looked worn thin at the collar. Her signature expensive blonde blowout, the one she used to maintain with weekly $300 salon appointments, was tied back in a messy, greasy knot. Her skin lacked its usual artificial tan, appearing sallow and exhausted under the harsh fluorescent lights of the cafe. Her fingernails, once meticulously manicured and painted, were chipped and cut short to comply with food service regulations. She looked absolutely drained, carrying the heavy, unmistakable posture of someone who had spent the last 8 hours standing on a hard linoleum floor dealing with impatient customers. Courtney froze. Her fingers stopped moving across the digital screen. She stared at me, her eyes widening in absolute horror as her brain processed the reality of the woman standing on the other side of the counter. I looked back at her, perfectly calm. I was wearing a tailored cashmere coat and a pair of pristine leather boots, looking exactly like the successful, independent woman my family had spent decades trying to suppress. The power dynamic between us had not just shifted, it had completely inverted and collapsed. "Whitney," Courtney whispered, her voice cracking. The sound barely carried over the loud hissing of the espresso machine. She looked around the bustling cafe, panic visibly rising in her chest. She was utterly humiliated. For her entire life, Courtney had constructed her identity entirely around the perception of effortless wealth and unearned superiority. She had mocked my steady accounting career. She had ridiculed my financial independence. She had built a massive following on social media, posting heavily edited photos of stolen luxury cars and catered parties, constantly using the caption, "Hard work pays off," to justify the extravagant lifestyle she was secretly funding through our grandmother's exploited pension. Now the illusion was shattered. She had been stripped of her stolen assets by the federal government. Her bank accounts were frozen, her credit was ruined, and her elite friends had abandoned her the exact second her name appeared in the federal indictment alongside our mother. She was drowning in massive legal debts, forced to rely on an overworked public defender while trying to survive on a minimum wage barista salary. "Whitney, please," Courtney stammered, leaning over the counter. Her eyes darted frantically, searching my face for any sign of sympathy, any hint of the older sister who used to absorb her abuse without complaint. Her voice dropped into a pathetic, desperate whine. "You have to help me. You have to tell them to unfreeze my accounts. I cannot live like this. The lawyers are taking everything I make. My rent is past due. I am on my feet for 9 hours a day getting yelled at by strangers over iced lattes. My back constantly aches. I cannot afford my car payments. I have absolutely nothing. You have the estate now. You have millions. You can easily write a check and make this stop. Mom is in federal prison, and I am entirely alone. Please, Whitney, I am your sister. You cannot just leave me here to suffer." She stared at me with wide, pleading eyes, expecting the old conditioning to kick in. She genuinely believed that if she looked pathetic enough, if she demonstrated just how far she had fallen, I would instinctively rush to rescue her. She expected me to open my wallet to pay off her massive legal debts, to restore her comfortable bubble of privilege. She thought the familial obligation she had ruthlessly exploited her entire life would somehow magically compel me to save her from the consequences of her own horrific actions. I looked at her faded uniform. I looked at the exhausted, defeated droop of her shoulders. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel anger or vindictiveness. I felt absolutely nothing. The woman standing behind the register was a complete stranger to me. She was just another consequence waiting to happen. "I need a large, dark roast black," I said, my voice perfectly steady and clear, completely ignoring her desperate monologue. Courtney blinked, her mouth falling open in shock. She stared at me as if I had spoken a foreign language. The customer behind me shifted impatiently, sighing loudly. Courtney swallowed hard, her hands shaking as she slowly turned back to the register. She tapped the screen with trembling fingers, avoiding my gaze entirely. "That will be $4.50, she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. I reached into my designer leather tote bag, the exact same bag that had carried the forensic evidence to her seized mansion, and pulled out my wallet. I retrieved a crisp $100 bill. I did not hand it to her. I placed it deliberately into the glass tip jar sitting on the counter. The heavy bill slid through the slot, settling noticeably among the small pile of scattered coins and single-dollar bills. Courtney's eyes snapped down to the tip jar. She stared at the $100 bill, her face twisting in a complex, agonizing mixture of intense relief and absolute crushing humiliation. She needed that money desperately. It was probably more than she made in an entire shift. But accepting it, taking a literal handout from the sister she had spent a lifetime treating like garbage, was the ultimate, undeniable confirmation of her total defeat. She was officially relying on my charity to survive. She looked slowly back up at me, her eyes swimming with tears. She expected me to deliver a long, angry lecture. She expected me to gloat or yell or demand a groveling apology for the years of psychological torment. She braced herself for the final crushing blow of our lifelong conflict. I picked up my receipt from the counter and met her tearful gaze with absolute icy serenity. I leaned slightly forward, resting my hand lightly on the edge of the cold stainless steel counter. "Hard work pays off, right?" I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal clarity. Courtney flinched as if I had physically struck her. The old Instagram caption, the hollow mantra she had used to justify her stolen privilege, echoed back at her with brutal, devastating precision. The color completely vanished from her face, leaving her looking entirely hollowed out. She had absolutely no defense. She had no mother to run to, no stolen money to hide behind. She was finally completely exposed. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on her and walked smoothly toward the pickup counter. I collected my steaming cup of dark roast, offered a polite smile to the other barista, and pushed open the heavy glass doors of the cafe. The crisp autumn air hit my face, feeling incredibly clean and fresh. I stepped out onto the bustling sidewalk, merging seamlessly with the flow of the successful independent people moving through the city. I did not look back through the cafe window. I did not need to. I knew exactly what was inside. Courtney was left standing frozen behind the register staring at $100 bill in a glass jar, finally forced to live in the real world. 6 months slipped by with the quiet, steady rhythm of a life finally lived on my own terms. The oppressive, bitter winter that had served as the backdrop for federal indictments and family betrayals eventually melted into a brilliantly warm summer. I purchased a beautiful, expansive beach house on the coast of Maine. It was not funded by fraudulent wire transfers or stolen pension funds. I bought it using the legitimate proceeds from my accounting firm and the meticulously managed trust my grandmother had legally placed under my complete control. It was a tangible monument to honesty and the ultimate refuge for the two of us. I sat on the wide wraparound cedar porch, listening to the rhythmic crashing of the Atlantic waves against the rocky shoreline. The salty morning breeze carried a profound, absolute peace that I had never experienced during my 32 years of trying to earn my family's conditional love. Beside me, in a plush, oversized Adirondack chair, sat Grandma Ruth. She was entirely unrecognizable from the frail, dehydrated woman I had rescued from that freezing state ward just under a year ago. Her cheeks were flushed with healthy color, and her sharp, witty eyes tracked a group of seagulls diving toward the water. She was wrapped securely in a thick, luxurious cashmere blanket, sipping a steaming cup of imported Earl Grey tea. She looked content, safe, and deeply loved. I took a slow sip of my own coffee and let my mind wander back over the chaotic journey that had brought us to this quiet coastline. For my entire adult life, I had exhausted my spirit trying to prove my worth to a mother who viewed me as a disappointment, and an extended family who saw me as nothing more than a convenient scapegoat. I had desperately chased the validation of people who were fundamentally incapable of providing it. The federal raid, the forensic accounting, the sheer brutality of severing those toxic ties had been the most terrifying gauntlet of my existence. But looking at my grandmother thriving in the morning sunlight, I knew the undeniable truth. I did not just save her from a devastating financial predator. I saved myself from a lifetime of begging for a seat at a table where I was never truly welcome. Sharon was currently sitting in a federal penitentiary serving a 15-year sentence. Courtney was trapped in the grueling reality of minimum wage labor, struggling to survive without the stolen wealth that had defined her entire shallow existence. The greedy aunts and uncles who had demanded bridge loans and college tuition from a stolen estate had been completely eradicated from my world by ironclad cease and desist orders. I had effectively taken out the trash, and it was the absolute best thing I had ever done for the survival of my family tree. I leaned back in my comfortable wooden chair, closing my eyes against the warm ocean breeze, breathing in nothing but pure, beautiful, absolute peace. Whitney's journey teaches us a profound and necessary truth about toxic family dynamics and the dangerous illusion of the golden child. For her entire life, she was conditioned to believe she was the disappointment, while her mother and sister hid their calculated cruelty behind a flawless, expensive facade. The core lesson here is that you cannot heal by negotiating with people who view your existence merely as a resource to exploit or a scapegoat to blame. Healing begins the exact moment you stop seeking validation from those who are committed to misunderstanding you. Whitney did not win her peace by engaging in endless screaming matches or stooping to their level of manipulation. She won by arming herself with undeniable facts, setting ironclad legal boundaries, and simply allowing the natural consequences of their own greed to catch up with them. True wealth is not found in stolen luxury cars or heavily curated social media posts. It is found in the absolute quiet peace of sitting on a porch, knowing everything you have was built on integrity and honest work. Walking away from a toxic family tree is never an act of betrayal. It is an act of profound self-preservation. When you finally cut away the dead weight, you give yourself the oxygen required to truly thrive. As the narrator who has walked you through this incredible journey of reclaiming power, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with people who were supposed to love you unconditionally? Have you ever realized that walking away was the only way to truly save yourself? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today to find their own courage. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about breaking toxic cycles and building a peaceful life on your own terms.